So this is a kind of interesting attempt by Heidegger to engage at this level. So always this is part of the a priori, which is both non-cognitive and non-experiential. Okay? So, I mean, I know we have a hard time wrapping our heads around that, but it is cognitive, right? In terms of cognitive understanding, or what we understand as cognitive understanding, cognizing, processes, or the I think, really in that way, thinking that way in the Cartesian sense of the I think, and also in the terminology of the a priori non-experiential, because we're always looking at the experiential. It's been my experience that. That kind of proposition, or it is my knowledge, or to the best of my knowledge. These kind of propositions for Heidegger are not part of the a priori, and therefore part of the world, right? Yep. Yep. So all a priori is really, again, the crucial moment here. What he's really trying to get beyond here is, the traditional movements in epistemology, in knowledge theory, of which Adorno borrows from in his 1937 piece that's not published until the 60s against epistemology, or against knowledge theory, or Kentis, right, on the one hand, and secondly of all, against the notion of experience, because experience is again not an ontological, it's an ontic category, right? So both cognizing activity, and this is the radicality of this in terms of the existential, right? The radicality is that the existential awareness and the existential positions, if you will, are always pre-cognitive and pre-experiential, right? So it's very radical in that respect, because your totality is no longer based on how much you know, or the absolute knowing, that takes care of the know-it-alls, and the movement of the scientific project, and also the problem of the Enlightenment. And secondly of all, I think it also takes care of our tremendous fixation on the politics of experience. Yeah? So, in a way, yeah. So, yeah, okay. So, just as a vague, I didn't read it as carefully as I should yet, but I'm trying. I'll deal with it next time. Yeah. Or maybe on in the Fridays. It's a good question. I see where you're trying to go here, but again, remember, it is the da that counts, the da of the sein, right?
There.
So of this, it's always the there-ness and which you mentioned in your email, the orientation.
Right.
This is a philosophy, if you will, of orientation. If we want to reframe it in terms of how would we describe it in almost popular terms, would be the orientation, right? Also, in speaking to the East too, as orientation as well, pointing outside of the West, right? But working through, again, Western metaphysics, which is going to be a long battle, as we know, right? Because the scientific project in Western metaphysics has obviously produced everything from nuclear weapons to great progresses in certain, aspects of our society, including the Industrial Revolution, including a lot of the technology. So, in a way, Heidegger is trying to point a way out of this, right, without being a Luddite. And I really think, contrary to Derrida, without a nostalgia. The nostalgia is more a kind of renewed dialogue, if you will, with the ancient Greek philosophy and primarily the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers. And that dialogue is taking place between German, right? One of the reasons he's doing so much of this hyphenatedness and et cetera is he's trying to get back to some kind of originary translation, if you will, between terms, that we see in Aristotle for substance, like ousia, how that would play out in our time in terms of our language. Instead of substance, right, there was a Latinate. How would we go back to, ousia as a different kind of, structure? yeah, which was the Aristotelian category for, for substance. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I mean, I don't know. I mean, just to wait for a few people to come in, but the main thing to remember here, I think, as a starting point, is that this is feminine in the German language, the Welt, and the Umwelt is the surrounding feminine world, right? The world, right? So it's not what he's really trying to articulate here is this, problematic of domination. He's trying to overcome the domination of nature, which takes place basically in the sixth book of the sixth part of the Discourse on the Method by Descartes, who says we will have dominion over nature. And this was part of his discourse. Okay, I'm going to interrupt this for a second because I got to give Arto a couple of things here. Yeah. Sort of half insists on doing a thing at his place on the 20th, on the final 15 through 20 of Adorno. So I thought we'd just skip next week, give ourselves some time, and begin again here on the 27th. Give some people some time. Rachel will be back from L.A. Hopefully we'll be finished with her boss. No texting allowed in this class. No, I'm just teasing. And I'm just teasing. Okay, but you'll be back on the 27th, right?
I won't be able to come. I can't come after today.
She's working weekends with us.
Yeah.
Till when?
Until the 10th.
10th of February?
Yeah. But
Which
don't
is
wait for me.
A Friday, or?
That's a Saturday.
Until the
for me.
10th?
Yeah.
So you'll miss the 27th and the 3rd?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll give Josh extra.
Get the notes.
Extra, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
all right,
Don't
okay,
worry.
no problem, okay.
I have the
Yeah, okay.
person filming.
So, all right, so this is my thinking then. Okay, so Stanley's going to do next week at his place, and Arto will put it up on the website, and we'll also, I'll send an email to everybody. This will be on January the 20th at 1 o'clock. Finalize Adorno. Maybe we'll have a good discussion about Adorno and Heidegger. I'll try to lead the discussion, towards the end of where we're going about, some of the stakes between the two of them, et cetera. And, okay, so that'll be next week, and then we'll meet again here, as far as I know, on the 27th. I think this room is open again on the 27th, the 4th. So what I would like us to do, I don't know how far we're going to get in today, because I'd like to spend some time on understanding, especially sections 31, 32, some of the what I consider the crucial stuff for post-structuralist accounts of language, which are sections 34, 35, 36, 37, and 30, and then 38, the thrownness. And then we have the question of care. I think I've assigned 41 and 42 primarily, as the beginning of the discourse on care. And what that means fundamentally to being in time. So this is my thinking. If we don't finish that, we would pick up with care on the 27th, sections 41, 42, and we would also read 43. 44 is okay. I mean, we don't really have to go through that thing, but 43, section 43, Dasein, worldliness and reality, is very important for looking at his relationship to Kant and this whole notion of objectivity, how he undoes that. Okay? All right? So then from there, what I would like us to start doing, and we'd spend at least 2 weeks on this, would be chapter 6. So in other words, we'd be finished with, after care, we're finished with the division 1. Right? Division 2, as you know, is under the horizon of time. First it's the preparatory for Dasein, the analytic, right, and the being towards death, and the questions of authenticity and inauthenticity, and then historicality, historicity, and history, all of which are different in Heidegger. We'll talk about that as we go forward, right? And then, but I thought what we would do, we would go all the way to temporality, the horizon of time, in chapter 6, which finishes out this unfinished manuscript, this unfinished treatise, which begins on page 384, if I'm not mistaken, 384, 385. Let me just see. Yeah.
385. Yeah.
385. Temporality and within timeness as the origin of the vulgar concept of time. So we'll talk about what the vulgar concept of time is. I want to take a lot of time to play on time with, on the question of the footnote, which again I emphasize, very important in section, this is on page, if I remember correctly, 410, right? Yep. Footnote 30. And very carefully with that. So we would do that on the 27th. Hopefully, I don't think we'll get through the entire passage. So let's think of the temporality. This section, this last section of Being in Time, chapter 6 of the second part 2 of division 2 of Being in Time as a 2-week reading, right, and a 2-week engagement on the 27th and February the 3rd, right? And then on the 10th, we'll go back into authenticity and inauthenticity and Dasein's everydayness, right? And then from there to historicality, and then we'll try to come back around. So I'm figuring we'll go all the way up to at least the first full Saturday in March to try to get through this, if that's all right with you guys, right? Yeah, there'll be like one more session in January, the 27th. Then we'll have the 3rd, the 10th, the 17th, and the 24th in February, and probably at least 6 more sessions, and maybe more. We'll see how much we get done, because I don't want to shortchange either myself or you in terms of not getting through most of the passages. And then you will be, quote, experts. No, you will go back and say, why the hell did I waste all this time on this fascist, right? Anyway, but as you can see with the fascists in power in the United States, they get away with everything, right? They can even tell the next time he's going to use, the N-word. It's unbelievable, but they, it's just every day they get away with something new, but it's a mass deflection, etc. So I brought something to read from Marcuse, because I'm going to use this in an essay. This is from 1965. He wrote a really famous essay that I recommend reading. It's called On Repressive Tolerance. On toleration as a repression. And this is a reading, of course, of John Locke's letter on toleration, and 3 people participated in the discussion: Robert Paul Wolff, and Barrington Moore, and Herbert Marcuse. And the book is entitled Critique of Pure Tolerance, but it's online, and Marcuse's contribution was on repressive tolerance. And just from a paragraph in that, I'll read you what Marcuse said about kind of education and the society at large. The tolerance of the systematic moronization of children and adults alike, this is what I say, Marcuse says education, it really in the United States is about the systematic moronization of its public, its people, alike by publicity and propaganda, the release of destructiveness and aggravated aggressive driving. I participate in that. The recruitment and training of special forces. I don't participate in that. The impotent, right, and benevolent tolerance towards outright deception in merchandising, waste and planned obsolescence, are not distortions and aberrations. They are the essence of a system which fosters tolerance as a means for perpetuating the struggle for existence and suppressing the alternatives. I think this is a very, very crucial comment that he made 53 years ago. Over a half a century ago, he's analyzing the condition of the American, public receptiveness and what's going on. Of course, this is written during the first build-up to Vietnam, right? After the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's historically situated. The beginning of the, quote, Great Society program, right, et cetera. Yeah, so 1965, and really to think about what toleration really means, or, in a different way, the busyness, uninhibited busyness, which is part of the inauthenticity of, I like this phrase of Heidegger's, uninhibited busyness, right?
It's a great section.
That's the inauthentic at work, right? Which will do anything to flee from its anxiety and its responsibility and its freedom. But in doing so, creates these mass distortions, right? Right? And these, this propaganda, etc. So in some way, the uninhibited busyness is playing out very much in the reception of this Trump, mediatic, campaign. Because I don't think they do this unconsciously. I think they manage it. They manage it. It may be his unconscious reproducing all of this, but I think it's part of a systemic, attempt to keep people completely blinded in what's really going on. It actually changes the focus from talking about the tax program as a complete assault on the 2/3 of the population at least, maybe even more, maybe 3/4, maybe up to 80%. I guess it depends on, how one uses deductions and these kind of things and what will remain. And if you've paid for your house or you're just starting out, there are many, many levels to this, so you can't really generalize it so easily. Also, of course, the appointment of judges everywhere. They're very conservative all throughout the United States. All of these things are missing the target of any kind of extended analysis, right? And also this is, And it also is setting up what America is great at in a larger perspective, because what we're witnessing is this class fraction between a capital group of nouveau riche, like the Adelsons, the Koch brothers. These are people that are nouveau riche. This is not old money like Carnegie, Rockefeller, DuPont, et cetera, Mellon, Getty. This is not money that has been in generations to generations. This is money that is 2, maybe 3 generations old at best. It's not obviously not Guggenheim or Ford, et cetera. Even though that exists, it seems like the tendency in the United States since the 1968, Chicago Convention and the assassination of Kennedy, has been to, every time you get into these kind of massive crises like the Republicans have created, or this kind of, total, denial of reality. You started with Reagan. Reagan was the first, people don't know this taxed Social Security. 50% of Social Security was taxed. Before 1981, Social Security was never taxed. So they went after the elderly as early, as 30, 35, 36 years ago now. Yeah. So anyway, the thing is this is paving the way for the Democrats. So everybody will start thinking about midterm elections, and that the hope will come somewhat from the other boss's party, the Google, technological capital, another form of nouveau richeness, right? But is interested in getting their program going, in some ways, So of course the left is always left out, because part of the left, or potential people coming to the left, will go the way of the Democratic Party. This is what's going to happen. They're going to say it's the lesser of two evils, which is always the argument. So they're very good at creating this, in terms of this, everydayness and distortions and propaganda, etc. I don't think they really care. I don't think Trump cares if he's reelected in 2020. They don't really care about this at this point. Yeah. So I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm trying to say let's be real, and then we're going to hear all these hopes out of Bernie Sanders. And with all due respect, Bernie Sanders is like maybe a step down from the New Deal in terms of programs. And his biggest donors outside of his base donors are basically the defense industry. So that tells you where he is in terms of foreign policy. So, I wouldn't get my hopes up about that. And Kamala Harris is very photogenic. She comes across very articulate. She's smart, lawyer, etc. Well groomed, the whole bit, nice pedigree and all of that. But she's definitely not, to the left of much further to the left of the Clintons, right? In a way. So you have this kind of thing going on. And and you can imagine what they do to Elizabeth Warren in the race. The right wing. So you have a black woman, a white woman. You've got Sherrod Brown out of Ohio, who at least has the rugged, individualistic looks, right? He looks sort of like the cowboy type, right? So he might play in some of those states. But anyway, just to
And Oprah,
kind of
don't forget Oprah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah.
And you get a car, and you get a car, and you get a car.
Look under your chair.
That's going to be the slogan. Just look under your chair. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I hear you. Okay, all right. Okay, so, Markusov was on to something here. Yeah, publicity and propaganda and the distortion. So anyway, that's, yeah. Okay, just to give you a couple of news items from the front, that on the educational front, I had a meeting yesterday with Rick Wolf and Michael Lardner of the Marxist. Yeah, why don't you turn that off for a second? I guess, and unless there are any questions. So is that good for everybody? The 27th? Mm-hmm. We'll do it here again on the 27th, give you some time to kind of review and, reacclimate. And the section on time is dense, right? It presupposes a lot of knowledge about the history of philosophy and the history of time. By the way, Heidegger did write a book called the History of Time. He wrote a book on time and its concepts. So if you want to look at that, that was earlier. So this was always a preoccupation of his.
It wasn't a brief history of time.
No, basic concepts. No, basic concepts of time. No, Stephen Hawking, I would have liked to have heard that conversation. Was ist das? This is Dr. Strangelove. Yeah. So anyway, okay. So so today I wanted to just go back to the diagram for a second on the articulation between world and man, just for a second, just to get into this section since we're going into care now. And let me just redo this in some way. So care was in the middle of between world and self, as we remember, right? And care, is really being in. Again, the emphasis on being in a world, right? Absolutely. Just keep that in mind because these prepositions, hi John, these prepositions are very crucial. Very, very crucial to what's going down. And being in, and this is what we're going to do today a little bit, you have, out of being in, you have something called understanding, right? And this is section 31. And I'm gonna just do this because I think this is always a good way to read. Sections, it begins with section 31, but also 68 is about the temporality of care, right? The temporality of understanding, of understanding. So you can read ahead and look at how he constitutes time and understanding. Right now we're just dealing with structures, existential structures, right? Here, with the understanding, okay? So in the being in, and so we have several levels to the understanding. Of course, the one was attunement, right? The other as interpretation. And this is one for understanding. Two, of course, was project. And then circumspection. So this is going on, understanding, and then actually coming out of care also is the section on language, rede, right, which is discourse in German, right? And this is a very important section, sections 34, 35, 36, 37 in particular. And I think that these sections, again, are crucial for an understanding of, the linguistic turn, which is referred to as the linguistic turn in philosophy. This and Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations helped produce, if you will, the linguistic turn in philosophy in the 1970s, and then more pronounced in academic circles in the 80s and 90s, right? And Richard Rorty being the primary interlocutor between Heidegger and the American audience in a book called The Consequences of Pragmatism, Heidegger and the Tradition, as well as a book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. This was the liberal interpretation of this, left liberal, because that's what Rorty was. So just so you know in terms of reception. Then there were people in the United States such as William Spanos, a Greek at I think upstate at one of the, I think Binghamton, Boundary 2 was his journal, very good, very advanced journal, took up Heidegger. And then of course in philosophy departments you had people across the country, including Michael Zimmerman in New Orleans, Rainer Schurman here in New York at the New School, Hubert Dreyfus in the West Coast at that you I think sent the YouTube out on, little short guy Hubert, Paul Rabinow and Hubert Dreyfus wrote a book on hermeneutics, on contemporary hermeneutics, and he actually wrote a Cunapony too. Then there are a whole group of people, of whom Dennis Schmidt, the person that writes with Babette Babich at Fordham, Joan Stombaugh, obviously, right? All of these people kind of joined in a kind of an American Heideggerianism, which began its movement, if you will, during the Reagan years. I want to say that, I want to say that. And a lot of people used to use the slogan, and I remember this very, very well, I'm just busy being free. Right, which is a very Heideggerian sense. I'm just being free, let things be as they are. And it was a kind of almost an apolitical statement. It's kind of interesting the way these things hit everyday speech, right? Okay, so to go back to this again, okay, in interpretation, and we're going to talk about this, attunement was really about, as I did the twofold structure, the thrownness, right? The Gewohrtheit. In some ways we can relate this, and a very good essay, Chris, i.e., would be between Heidegger's thrownness and Mallarmé's roll of the dice, right? Every revolution is a roll of the dice, the coup de dé, right? and then, of course, the thrownness and then the project, right? Right? These two things. And going back to this whole notion of world, right? World is happening with thrownness, right? Part of the a priori, right? Part of the a priori. And so then you have interpretation as the as structure of interpretation. So interpretation has an as structure. It has a foreground and a direction. So you have the role of the reader, if you will, or the role of interpretation, right? And the position of the reader, if you will, right? To go to sort of kind of response theory. The foregrounding of this as well in interpretation. And then you have, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the meaning, or really in a more accurate way, the direction. Remember, I gave you multiple definitions of sin, right? S-I-N-N. As both meaning, sense, and direction. So when you say in the Berkeleyan sense, you're meaning in the sense of that philosopher, also meaning his being, his thought, right, his meaning, but at the same time also the direction of the thought, how it plays out in the history of the philosophy. So when you speak that way. So really direction as, playing the role of something, right? And you can, the theatrical, maybe in some ways too, right? Part of the dialogic, if you will. the foregrounding tendency, that's what is just being disclosed, right, showing itself, and then the direction that it takes, right? All of this is operative in this crucial word, interpretation, that comes out of the understanding. And let me just do something here. Stehen is the German word. I hyphenated it just to show you, understanding, right? But really, in a way, it means to take control of. That's its usage, taking control of. So understanding means taking control of something, right? Yeah. I know it sounds awkward in English, you stand under, but you're really taking control of something. Yeah? Yep. So the Verstehen, the understanding. So the understanding has these parts, right? The interpretation, right? Then the project, and then the circumspection. And remember, I talked about sight and the uses of the certain words of the sicht, right, in sight, right? So this is all going on here. So this is really where he is in section 31, 32, 30, etc. Now, of course, this again, very crucial, a politics of attunement. I think we could talk about, people talk about the attention economy. It might be, for our purposes, to radicalize this even further, to talk about an attunement economy, right, in the world, right? Not only the attention economy, which is maybe a derivative of the attunement economy. So we could maybe just throw that out as a possibility. How one is thrown, right? And what is that project in the attention, right? And then, you can see in here, when we talk attention span, you're coming back down to circumspection, right? So there are many things here that are interconnected and layered. Right? Okay? All right, is this pretty clear? I mean, I want to kind of preface this today with, this section on understanding. Because this is a section that is very under-talked about and actually glossed over by many of the commentators, as well as a section that I think is absolutely crucial for us. How do we get to understanding? How do we get to this taking control of things in the world, and et cetera? Okay, so I wanted to do that again, presupposing the being in a world, right? You're being in a world, right? Yeah. And Heidegger does this. Adorno criticizes him ad infinitum about this use of the German language, but in Heidegger's case, it really is to kind of reorient, a lot of movement, etc., based around multiple layers here. It's not so simple that it's just a barbaric attempt with the German language, right, to make the German language speak Greek. It's something else is going on here as well, right? So anyway, I'm not an advocate. I don't want to be an advocate for Heidegger. I mean, in a sense, it's more important to really understand what this is about and how powerful this can be for our purposes, etc., going forward, right? Even though it is part of conservative revolution. Mm-hmm. And have you read the book by Junger on work?
No, but it's in
the okay.
But then Schurman intervened, so it kind of.
Oh, you've been reading Being and Acting.
It's incredible.
Yeah, Rainer Schurman. Being and
Being and Acting. Yeah.
Being and Acting. Yeah, on the Anarchy. He actually takes up acting and understanding in a very radical way.
Heidegger very radically. I mean, he considers him just one of the core thinkers of a potential radical politics. Sure. Right. Which is kind of.
Well, I mean, the reading here, again, politically speaking, to the philosopher, to the philosophical mind, is that Parmenides, where thinking and being is the same, right? That really the politics of left and right is meaningless without, thinking through the structure of being, right? It's meaningless. Because then you're going to say some boys on the left, some boys on the right, some girls on the left, some boys on the right, and then ultimately it becomes an ontic, battle only, right? And it does not really gather enough really it's not really transformative in the deepest sense of the word, in the use of the word radical to that moment, right? Yeah. And when Marx says, and this is Heidegger meditated on the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. And again, I'm not trying to, say Heidegger is more radical than Marx, but he did interpret, he says, what Marx missed is the active interpretation. Philosophers hitherto have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to transform it. Heidegger is looking at his interpretation as transformative as well. Acting is transformative. I'm sure Marx, if he was alive and there was a real discussion, open-ended discussion, would certainly say, active interpretation is certainly what he wants to engage as well. Yeah. I mean, in some ways. You raise your eyebrows, yeah. That's okay. I see old Carl, working in that forebrain. That's good. Yeah, anyway, it's good. Yeah.
Schumann makes this incredible point where he says that Heidegger inverted the ordering of thinking before acting, which kind of evolved within the Enlightenment thinking, but also
Yes.
with the Greeks.
Yes.
He reverses that in order to change thinking. So he said, if you want to change, if you want to break out of liberalism, you can't just keep thinking through liberal categories and then finding an exit.
That's
You have
always
to
the
first
problem
act.
with our politics.
You have to
Yes.
act, interrupt the thinking, and then the other thinking will emerge, which is kind of an amazing.
Exactly. So why don't we reorder our whole thinking about immigration instead of just DACA? You know what I mean? I mean, this becomes the issue-based, what is the issue of the day kind of mentality, and in some ways becomes the uninhibited busyness that the media becomes preoccupied with. I'm leading up, in some ways, we're going to talk about this maybe in 3 weeks, the dictatorship of the they-self, right? The publicness in which Heidegger wants to critique too, And I'm not saying I personally agree with all of this, but it is extremely radically and different, right? I mean, again, this is another, yeah. I think, listen, I also learned that Adorno had a breakdown when he was writing his book on Kierkegaard. I learned that recently. Heidegger, of course, had a breakdown after the war. And I think he was having a breakdown when he was writing Contributions to Philosophy, 1935, 36, 37, when he saw National Socialism wasn't what it was cranked up to be. And, he probably found himself in a position, that, he protected himself, so to speak. I mean, I don't really know exactly, I'm not a
Sherman
historian.
says at that point he started writing about Parmenides instead of the more politically, sort of directly political lectures that he was
Yes,
delivering.
that's true.
And then
Yeah.
he just went back into seemingly more apolitical, as a way of shielding himself from. And
Yeah.
he said that the Nazis stopped publishing his lectures after
They did.
35
They did.
or something.
They did,
just
and
didn't publish anything.
they attended all of his lectures. Baumler and Rosenberg were in the Nietzsche lectures. Yeah, he was
They
surveilled.
censored him.
No question about being surveilled. He wasn't censored like Freud, where they didn't read him at all or allow any kind of
They just
teaching
didn't,
of psychoanalysis.
promote him.
So, but yeah.
He also enjoyed sitting in darkness.
Maybe he had migraine.
When it became like 6 p.m. in the hut, when Sherman visited him, he never turned the light on. And they spoke for 2 hours
That's
in darkness. He just didn't like the light. Like he didn't, he saw no need for it.
We have the light.
When Sherman said the conversation was so intense that he didn't even notice that there was no lights on. Sherman didn't, He said it was incredibly intense.
Yeah. I think Sherman was 20 years old, 21
25
years,
or something.
20, in his early 20s when he went to visit Heidegger. Yeah. All right. Okay. So, to go back to this, so we're going to, do section 31. So I want to point out some of the things there that are crucial. First of all, last time, we did, kind of gloss over fear, right? And really what Heidegger's asking in section 30, how is fearing possible? He's really asking that question. He's not asking about the fear of the object, right? It's due to attunement and a concern for what is. what is the mode of existence. So it's always a concern for what is in the world is what fear is about. So this section 30, even though we'll probably go back to this when we get to the section on anxiety, which is a little later, but anyway. So it's kind of interesting. I like this section. This is page 138. I think this could be worked with too in terms of a lot of good thinking for today. The factors constitutive for the full development of fear can vary. Thus, various possibilities of fear result. Approaching nearby belongs to the structure of encountering what is threatening. When something threatening itself suddenly bursts into heedful being in the world in its character of not right now, but in any moment, fear becomes alarm. Accordingly, we must distinguish in what is threatening the nearest approach of what threatens, and the way in which this approach itself is encountered, namely, its suddenness. But when what threatens has the character of something completely unfamiliar, fear becomes horror. And when something threatening is encountered in the aspect of the horrible, and at the same time is encountered as something alarming, suddenness, fear becomes terror. So you have here, structures of horror, terror, right? And of course, alarm, alarm, right? Okay? And when we're familiar with further variations such as timidity, shyness, nervousness, and misgiving. But you notice how Heidegger starts with alarm, horror, and terror. And then he goes into the kind of more timid approaches. So you get an idea of where this guy is coming from. All modification of fear's possibilities of attunement point to the fact that Dasein as being in the world is fearful. Right? This fearfulness must not be understood in the ontic sense of a factical, isolated tendency, but rather as the existential possibility of the essential attunement of Dasein in general. So we're thrown as fearful, right? Which is interesting. And really you'll see later that essentially what we are at bottom is mere anxiety. And he'll use the phrase mere anxiety at the bottom of everything. Yeah. And that's good to know that anxiety is not, quote, he doesn't use it as overwhelming, he uses it as mere anxiety. It's kind of interesting, that he'll do this. And, okay, so in general, which is, of course, not the only one of the existential possibilities, okay? So he's going to move on now to another possibility, that is of understanding, okay? So in this section on understanding, as I mentioned, the word for understanding, Verstehung, is on the board, to have control or over, and it also, to put it in Paul Tillich's phrases, the courage to be, right? And Tillich, as you know, was a Democrat socialist, a social democrat who worked at Union Theological Seminary for a good part of his adult life, and wrote a very good book, which I recommend, The Courage to Be, on the existential, thing. It's not a book on political and social philosophy, but basically about what he would consider the courage to have understanding, the courage to take control, right, etc., right? So anyway, this section is going to talk about interpretation, the world as the project, right? It's always in the sense of a future world, but not yet to be realized, right? So going back to this temporal structure, again, you have the future is really, the having beenness is the future in some ways, okay? So, you're dealing with a kind of futurist past. I want to point this out too today. I think it's important that we have this. For Heidegger, the understanding is the having beenness, or what we would call the past. Right? This is also part of the future, right? 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 The future, like I said, is a springing forth, right, if you will. The future, not yet to be realized. But we're not always, ahead of ourselves. What is really happening is this having been-ness is not yet realized. Right? It's not yet realized. So what you have here in Rainer Koselleck's language, futures past. Right? And Lacan, very interestingly took this up in terms of the Freudian model, that anxiety meets us, and our anxiety is always futural, because it's the past meeting us in the future. Right? So this is very interesting to remember, right? It's not like we're, quote, overcoming or only working through the past, which we are in the future. We're working through the past in Freudian terms, and this is good. You work through a neurosis, in that sense. But this having been-ness is part of our understanding, which is not yet realized, which will meet us, in our future. We are what we become. Right? He uses the Nietzschean thing. I think there's a footnote on this. I think I wrote it down. He has a footnote, which is actually not, it's what Nietzsche said, fundamentally, that, we are, yes, but who are you, this is on page 41, the one who lets go and becomes. Right, this is on the bottom of 141. But who are you, what comes after the subject, the one who lets go, right, of the subject and becomes. Okay, kind of interesting. We'll go back to that, but I wanted to point that out. So again, the line here, the having been-ness is back here, but projected out this way to the future in terms of the springing forth, right? This is what originative really means to the existential analytic, that you're springing forth this having been-ness. Now, you don't know all of this. You might say, my past does not allow me to do this. This might be all wrong in terms of your understanding, right? Right? So we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of May of '68, right? Is that having been-ness possible, and then you begin to think through here, in some ways, the notion of event, right? In Badiou's sense, right? As these political events, right? Right? Yeah. And how is 1789, right, was related to as a Roman costume drama, right, of a takeover, right, etc. This is how one begins to think of history, right, in some ways. 1871, so Badiou's events, just to work with this, right? The having been-ness of these four events, right, still may be in the not yet, have not really been to the place of becoming, even though they may have happened and having been, right, they're part of what, I like Bloch's phrase, the not yet, right? I think Heidegger and Bloch are very close on this, in terms of, their temporality. This is the principle of hope in Bloch, which is taken from possibility is higher than actuality. So again, keep in mind, retain, if you will, once again, possibility is higher than actuality. And actuality in German, by the way, means the now. Right? So it's kind of interesting that the present, right, is not the highest, right? It's this relationship, right? The present would be on this line, the now, the Nunc stans, the now time, the stance of the now.
The new, the new Invisible Committee book is called Now, actually.
Oh, it is? Good, yeah. Good. Well, now is the time, yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting because that's, Foucault would say that's foreclosed by neoliberal ideology because it's all about the actual. He says
Yes,
in the lecture,
that's
right?
correct.
There is
It's
no
all about
future.
the actual and the algorithmic trading systems to go into political economy here. All of this is based on the now time, right? And this is one of the reasons I think we have to study that footnote carefully. Footnote to section 82, of which Derrida, of course, responds to. If you want to, I mean, it's a complicated, commentary on Heidegger's footnote. Note on being in time. But anyway, it's very important for us to see the philosophy of now and how the Aristotelian, notion of now time and succession of nows, how the Augustinian notion of time plays out in the present, right? In the present, right? So this becomes very interesting. And going back to what Arto was saying, both about Foucault and then also going back to Marx's thesis between interpretation and transformation, Foucault makes a very good point, and Kant makes a very good point. In the Age of Enlightenment, or what is Enlightenment, Kant in 1784 makes the point: you can have a socio-economic revolution, but unless you have a revolution in thinking, you are condemned to repeat the same stuff. Yeah, the same stuff. So Venezuela, what do? They do the same thing that Cuba does. One money source, right? Almost a one crop, in this case, one fossil fuel, right? Economy, right? Etc. Repeating the same old mistakes of the past, right? In some ways, because the revolution may have happened in terms of some redistribution, some programs, right? And this upsurge, but at the same time, the thinking didn't take place.
Yeah.
So this is what I think Heidegger is speaking to, what Foucault speaks to in his commentary, by the way. I think to me, this is one of the great works of Foucault. I mean, it's very basic, but it's very, very, very solid in terms of its approach to the political, in which he talks about Kant's notion of the Enlightenment. He reads what is enlightenment, this little piece, this 5 pages that Kant wrote, little journalistic article. Foucault does a long commentary. What is critique? What is enlightenment? What is the actual? All these things that are being brought up.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's funny in the case of Venezuela, Chavez was stuck with a bureaucracy that was just going to do what they'd always done,
Right.
And so his major task was try to get around that bureaucracy. So he
Right.
set up all these missions
Mm-hmm.
that were, attempts
Parallel.
to
Right.
to get around the bureaucracy, attempts
Right.
to short circuit it.
Yeah. This
and-
leads to David, putting out the email, and I'm sorry I couldn't go. I may go
Yeah, we
again.
both-
We both went? Oh, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, a great film. It's Tomas Guitera.
I know, yeah,
Tomas.
I realize.
Yeah, but it's okay. I
But
mean, yeah. It's
almost
all right.
I'd seen it back in the 70s.
I did too.
And I hadn't seen it since.
Me either. I haven't seen it since
Oh,
the
my
70s.
God.
I've seen it several times, but I never knew, and most people didn't know that it was based on a
So-
novel.
Yes, that's right.
And it was Denoise, the author, that was there last night. It was really, really interesting.
I think in English it's Memories of Underdevelopment, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
But in Spanish, I think it's closer to a memoir, right? About underdevelopment, right? It's not really just memories. Is it a memoir?
know. I
Maybe
haven't-
I'm wrong.
I
I'm not
haven't
sure.
Memoria, or I don't know if
Yeah.
it's singular or plural.
Okay,
It's
okay.
Memoria de
Yeah.
sub desarrollo.
But it actually speaks to this bureaucracy as well, this whole thing that you're
Sure.
speaking to.
Oh, yeah.
Guterres Olea's film that I love is The Last Supper. There's a wonderful scene on Cartesianism in that film, by the way, about the lie and the truth, and how we've been living a lie ever since. It's a wonderful sequence when he puts the master to sleep. You remember? You don't know this, the premise of The Last Supper is that the slaveholder invites the slaves, including the militant slave, to have Easter dinner with him. Right?
At
So they have
one
some.
day they can be equal. They can sit at
Yes,
the
one
same
day
table.
they'll be able to equal. They can sit at the table, right? So anyway, the chief rebellious slave, right, actually puts the master to sleep and then tells the story how the lie began. The lie of bourgeois control, the lie of domination, all of these things. It's a wonderful sequence, right? A wonderful sequence in the Thomas Guitera film, right?
Yeah.
And it ends with this incredible, beautiful cuts of Black Panthers going through waterfalls. beautiful long sequence at the end of the film. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. Yeah. So, but anyway, yeah. Going back to this whole thing, because part of the problem is with activism, it always wants to know activism. How does this change things, right? And I think what Heidegger and even Marx in his way, because you have to remember, Marx was not, quote, so activist when he's writing Capital later in his life, right? It's really an interpretation and a description of the capitalist mode of production with a necessary critique. He's much more critical and active in his early days, but as an older, the mature Marx is very withdrawn to the library and the theoretical in some ways. So this is interesting that this whole thing of, the interpretation and transformation, I mean, I like the aspect of both, and I think that reading should be in transformative. This is really the Derridian project, if you will. This is really the project of, the group for research for the teaching of philosophy in France, was that reading was always transformational. Yeah. So this set up a whole discussion. And who started this? Reading Capital. I mean, Althusser did not, just come up. We have a study group on Capital. It's called Reading Capital. What does it mean to read? So this is very interesting, in a way that this comes back in some ways. Again, I mean, I'm just trying to give a locus here. I'm not saying that this is completely, because, you have many avant-garde experiments in language. You have the Taoists and the Surrealists just beginning during this period. Of course, you have Roman Jakobson, you have the Prague School of Linguistics, you have Mukarovsky in Prague, you have the Copenhagen School of Linguistics, you have Saussure, right, in terms of the general course on linguistics, Jakobson's Futurism and the Russian. So all of these experiments are going around, but I think, again, Heidegger gives you multiple layers here in this section 31 through 37, beginning with understanding. Yeah? Okay, so let's go back to this. Yeah. Any questions or thoughts before we? Okay. All right. So okay. So what we have here, again, going back to the earlier diagram, that understanding is projecting Dasein towards its possibilities. It's only through understanding or taking control of that one begins to know one's possibilities and how one's projected in this thrownness and project. Right? And so the world presents, right, again, the a priori is presenting a series of possibilities, of service possibilities. He uses the language of service possibilities, which is probably taking from Husserl, who said, philosophers are the functionaries of mankind, which I don't agree with at all. But anyway, this is Husserl, that they were the functionaries of mankind, the civil servants, right? The guardians of culture in Nietzsche's case, in some ways, right? But you consider possibilities because you are free. This is where the whole freedom to let things be as they are, it comes out, right? You're not trapped within the objective world of present at hand. Right? How will I ever beat this computer? How will I ever, go beyond artificial? These are not real questions to one's possibilities at all, right? The objective world of science in a certain way. Yeah? Yeah? So, and the world of objectivity is indifferent to possibilities. Is always indifferent to existential possibilities. So this is very important to remember, right? Right? Now, knowledge is only possible because of one's existential awareness. You have to be aware of one's Dasein to be aware of knowledge. So this is why any kind of testing of intelligence, and I love Marx's comment when asked, are there more people, some people more intelligent than others? He replied, we will not know the answer to that question until we have full equality. That's a very Heideggerian answer in some ways, because until we have existential awareness, right, we cannot measure, IQ, we cannot measure, intelligence, right? Yeah,
Where did he say that? It's a new one for me.
I think he said it in conversation to Kugelman or one of the, someone asked him the question. I'll look it up. I always love that by Marx. So, yeah. Some people more intelligent than others. We won't know the answer to that question until we have full equality, which is a great. I mean, couldn't have asked for a better response, right? Right? He didn't base it on class, et cetera. He didn't say, that they had an advantage until we have full equality. Then we can begin to talk about that. Yeah? So, okay. So what happens here in the understanding is one begins to project one's possibilities, right? This is where the possibilities are. Right. Yeah, you're more than what you factually are, right? More than what you factually are. Right? So your day job, you're much more than your day job. You're much more than your biological, your breeding, right, etc. In a way, you're more than your class position, too. In a way, this is not a class argument. I'm not saying it's right, but he's not really bringing class into the equation, right? No? Right? Right? All right? So it's facticity that we deal with, the having beenness. Right? The having beenness, the facticity, rather than the factual. Okay? So these possibilities become available to us or accessible to us not through cognition, pure cognition, through pure learning or pure, knowledge, right? Nor through experience, right? The possibilities are already available, right, in existence, right, which is the structure of the inquirer himself, right? So again, we're much more than we are factually. Chris is much more than an ex-worker at the now bankrupt Lehman Brothers, right? Right? Even though it's part of our having beenness, and we will try to extract that when we discuss the derivatives markets, etc. Right? Right? Yeah? Yeah? I mean, listen, in one way, background is too mild a word to what he's really doing here. Because some of us are very unaware of how much having beenness we have. What's there. This is a kind of interesting, approach here, how much having beenness there really is there. And this has nothing to do with schooling or cumulative learning. Right? Again, this is, again, in Stanley's terms, against schooling. Right? In Aronowitz's terminology, it's against schooling. It's really for education, in a different way. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's kind of interesting that the schooling itself, the radicality here is against cumulative learning, cumulative grade point averages, testing, teaching to the test. All of these things are being, basically deconstructed, even though he doesn't list, like, I'm listing here, right? Right? So, in another word, in another vein, it's Sartre who takes this up as our freedom is we're condemned to be free, which is a wonderful phrase, I think. We're condemned to be free. We're just not free, right? We're condemned to be free. And our existence is free in Heideggerian sense, free for, again, possibilities. This is crucial as a retention. Possibility is higher than actuality. This is again, he reads this as in Kant's thesis about being, that being is not a real predicate. Right? Okay? Okay. Let me read a couple of crucial sections here. I marked maybe to give you, at least crucial sections you could study. Okay. Page 138, the beginning. Attunement is one of the existential structures in which the being of the there dwells. That tells you a lot right there, where he's going. Attunement is one of the existential structures in which the being of the there dwells. Equipped primordial with it, understanding constitutes this being. Attunement always has its understanding, even if only by suppressing it. Understanding is always attuned. If we interpret understanding as a fundamental existential, we see that this phenomenon is conceived as a fundamental mode of the being of design. On the other hand, understanding in the sense of one possible kind of cognition, among others, distinguished as explaining, must be interpreted like explaining as an existential derivative. It's not originative, right? It's derivative, right? Very important, of the primary understanding which constitutes the being of the there in general. So both experience and cognitive abilities, capacity, right, is derivative here, not primary or originative. Okay, our previous inquiry already encountered this primordial understanding, but without explicitly taking it up within the theme under consideration. To say that Dasein, existing in its there, means, and this is good, this is very good, world is there. Its Dasein is being in. Okay? So again, the a priori, the there, world is there, right? Its there being is being in, where we are, this being in the diagram, right? Being in is there as that for the sake of which Dasein is. Existing being in the world as such is disclosed in the for sake of which that we call this disclosedness understanding. Right? In understanding, the forsake of which the significant grounded therein is also disclosed. The disclosure of understanding is that for the sake of which and of significance, equipped primordially pertains to the entirety of being in the world. Significance is that for which world as such is disclosed. The statement that the for the sake of which and significant are disclosed in Dasein means that Dasein is a being which, as being in the world, is concerned about itself. Right? It's not only taking care, but concerned about itself. Remember the structure of care, we talked a little bit about that already, as concern, the taking care of, right? Yeah, we'll go back to that, of course. Speaking ontically, so, right, we sometimes use the expression to understand something to mean being able to handle it, being up to it, being able to do something. In understanding as an existential, the thing we are able to do is not a what, but being as existing. Cannot be objectified. Cannot be essentialized. Right? Not a whatness. The mode of being of Dasein as a potentiality of being lies existentially in understanding. Right? As a potential for being lies existentially in understanding. Dasein is not something objectively present, which then has in addition the ability to do something. Rather, it is primarily being possible. Again, very radical in a sense. You're not adding to cognitively to knowledge, right? Etc. So it doesn't matter to Heidegger. Of course, you get infrastructure and all kinds of different levels, but it doesn't matter if you're at Yale or Timbuktu in this case, right? In this case, in terms of the background, if you strip away the veneer of the ontic determinations, right? Yeah. Okay. Right? Dasein is always what it can be and how it is its possibility. This is again crucial. I know the language is somewhat tautological, but I think he's doing it for a reason, right? Dasein is always what it can be and how it is its possibility. The essential possibility of Dasein concerns the ways of taking care of the world which we characterized, of concern for others, and always already present in all of this, the potentiality of being itself for its own sake. The being possible, which Dasein always is existentially, is also distinguished from empty logical possibility and from the contingency of something objectively present. Science is being taken over that. Science does not think of being. Right? Where this or that can happen to it. Very interesting. Yeah? As a modal category of objective presence, possibility means what is not yet real and not always necessary. It characterizes what is only possible. Ontological, it is less than reality and necessity. In contrast, possibilities and existential is the most primordial and the ultimate positive ontological determination of Dasein. Everybody in this room is a possibility. You know, as Kafka once said about himself, I am a memory come alive. That's a kind of way of stating, you know, a possibility. He said that about himself. I am a memory come alive. Franz Kafka. Right? As is the case with existentiality, possibility can initially be prepared for solely as a problem. Understanding as a potentiality for being that is disclosive offers the phenomenal ground to see it at all. Right? Interesting, right? So, possibility as an existential does not refer to free-floating potentiality. You're not a free-floating potentiality, I can do everything, right? Yeah, I understand. In the sense of the liberty of indifference, right? This is nice, right? I like that phrase too. As essentially, that's Trump right there, the liberty of indifference, right? You know, yeah, we make a lot of money, you know, feeding the media these slogans for, you know, late night TV shows. Anyway.
Too sophisticated.
And essentially, right, and essentially attuned, Dasein has always already got itself into definite possibilities, right? As a potentiality for being, which it is, it has let some go by. You've had to release some of those possibilities, some of that liberty of indifference, right? It constantly adopts the possibilities of its beings, grasps them, and then sometimes fails to grasp them. So sometimes you have no idea of what your having beenness would allow you in terms of this futural having beenness, you know, coming to fruition, and therefore it doesn't, right? Yeah. So that becomes the notion of the missed, right, opportunity, the missed encounter, you know, these kind of things, right? But this means that Dasein is a being possible which is entrusted to self. It is thrown possibility throughout, right? Again, the role of the die and the contingent nature of this, right? And this is the aleatory and certainly in Althusser to a degree. To a degree. I'm not saying it's the same, but to a degree there are connections going on here. Yeah. Yeah. Dasein is the possibility of being free. So here's the definition, is the possibility of being free for its own most potentiality of being. And again, the quote at the bottom of page 141, you know, the one who lets go and becomes, right? Okay. Being possible is transparent for it in various possible ways and degrees. Okay? Okay. So let me just go forward a little bit because again, to me this is a very crucial section, but I don't want to, you know, belabor it for 3 hours. You know, I mean, we could do that, but I don't want to do that. Right? This is not a Straussian exercise here. You know. Anyway, okay. This is interesting. Page 141. Excuse me, at the top of the page. Project is the existential constitution of being in the realm of factical potentiality of being. And as thrown, Dasein is thrown into the mode of being of projecting. So here we have the thrownness and the projection that I did on the diagram, the two moments, you know, I've erased that, but anyway. Dasein is thrown into the mode of the being of projecting. Projecting has nothing to do with being related to a plan thought out, right? According to which Dasein arranges its being, but as Dasein, it has always already projected itself and is, as long as it is, projecting. As long as it is, Dasein has already understood itself and will understand itself in terms of possibilities. One understands oneself in terms of one's possibilities, always, right? Not the actuality of the now or of the situation, right? And so the temporality, again, here is futures past, or in the French language, the futur antérieur, right? Yeah. Which was the title of a journal that Tony Negre and some students at the at the École Normale put together in the 90s, Futur Antérieur. Right? Anyway, Design, as long as it is, has always understood itself and understands itself in terms of possibilities. Furthermore, the project character of understanding means that understanding does not thematically grasp that upon which it projects.
Sorry.
Namely,
Right on cue. There was always a possibility.
Yeah.
namely the possibilities themselves. Such a grasp precisely takes its character of possibility away from what is projected. It degrades it to the level of a given intended content, whereas in projecting, project throws possibility before itself as possibility, and as such lets it be. As projecting, understanding is the mode of being of design in which it is its possibilities as possibilities. So the project is always the possibility of possibilities. If that makes sense, I mean, I know it's a kind of tautological language, but he's really talking about the possibility of possibilities within each project. Right? Okay? Because of the kind of being which is constituted by the existential projecting, Dasein, and this is very important, is constantly more than it actually is. Okay? And this is where he starts with the actuality, right, and the future. Right? Assuming that one wanted to, and if one could, give an inventory of it as something objectively present in its content of being. So anyone says they're doing objective history or objective science, to Heidegger is out of their mind. I mean, not there. But it's never more than it factically is, because its potentiality of being belongs essentially to its facticity. But as being possible, design is also never less. It is existentially, and this is again important on the future, that which is not yet in its potentiality of being. So this having beenness, has not yet been, quote unquote, actualized or realized. The not yet. Right? And only because the being of the there gets its constitution through understanding and its character of project, only because it is what it becomes or does not become, can it understandably say to itself, become what you are. And that's Nietzsche, become what you are. And again, amor fatum, it's not amor fati. For Heidegger, amor fatum is the love of the facticity, not the love of the facts or the factical. Okay? And that's sort of the motto or the slogan, amor fatum. Okay? Then he'll go on about project and authentic and inauthentic, etc., the disclosiveness of the world, right? In section 146 on page 141. Okay. So again, he's trying to get to some kind of notion of transparency to the inquirer. I was going to go over this. In its character, page 142, a project, understanding constitutes existentially what we call the sight, the Sicht of Dasein. And if you go back to your notes about 6-7 sessions ago, I went through the notions of Sicht, many levels of the notions. I don't know, I think I have them here. I can probably tell you what date it was, but I'll look in a minute. But anyway, let's go over this. In accordance with the fundamental modes of its being, which we characterized as the circumspection, Umsicht, and remember, so we have sicht, sight, circumspection, Umsicht, of taking care, any considerateness, right? Rücksicht, of concern, right? And as the sight geared towards being as such, for the sake of which Dasein is as it is, Dasein is equipped more primordially, sight existentially, existing together with the disclosiveness of the there. I'm on page 142 above section 147. Right?
Okay.
Okay. All right. Dasein, right? We shall call the sight, which is primarily and as a whole related to existence, that of transparency, right? So he's going to collapse sight, right? Circumspection, right? Considerateness into transparency. Okay? This is where we get the transparent. We chose this term to designate correctly. So when you hear the word transparency in these stupid academic meetings or in some of these other places, you can say, are you speaking on the level, right, of sight, of taking care, of considerateness, right, circumspection, etc.? Or are you talking of something else? Because you're not really being transparent without all those elements. Okay? And there's a very good book by the Korean German philosopher called The Transparent Society. I'll bring it next time. It's a beautiful little precis, about 90 pages on the Society of Transparency. Wonderful about how idiotic this whole notion is and what it really means. Right? Right? It's every other word, every day. Let's be transparent. Right? Let's be civil and transparent. Anyway, so Heidegger, it helps you here. We choose this term to designate correctly understood self-knowledge in order to indicate that it is not here a matter here of perpetually finding and gazing at a point, which is the self, which is funny, yeah, but of grasping and understanding the full disclosiveness of being in the world throughout all of its essential constitutive factors. Existing beings glimpse themselves. This is interesting, right? Glimpse, right? Themselves only when they have become transparent to themselves, equipped more primordially in their being with the world, in being together with others as the constitutive factors of their existence. This is how one renders transparent, or how we get the transparent inquirer. This is the Dasein as inquirer and as understanding. Okay? This is really how you get to the inquiry, how you make an inquiry, too. And I refer you back to Gramsci, Study of Philosophy, note number 1, in which he talks about self-knowledge. So this is related somewhat to Gramsci, even though Gramsci does not elaborate it as dense as this, right? But Gramsci does privilege this, right, in the study of philosophy, in note 1, in the study of in the second part of this thing. So conversely, the opposite, of course, transparency, right? The opacity of Dasein is not solely and primarily rooted in egocentric self-deceptions, but just as much in ignorance about the world. So the people that speak of this transparency, just giving it lip service, are really speaking from the position of opacity and ignorance. It's very interesting the way he sets this up. So you have a very good, this section on understanding, and again, very talked about, under commented upon, et cetera, but I think very crucial for our own, purposes here, going forward. Right? All right. So ignorance about the world. And this German word means not having knowledge. Unkenntnis. Erkenntnis is knowledge in German, right? And Erkenntnis theory is epistemology, theories of knowledge. Adorno's, for example, Against Epistemology is on knowledge theory. That's the German title. It would have been better translation to think about it as, I like the against, it's the turn, obviously, And he and Heidegger are very, very close on this matter, even though he takes on Husserl's epistemology here, as is Heidegger taking on Husserl's epistemology here, which is another story. But let me just say this, that one thing Adorno and Heidegger have in common vis-a-vis epistemology, they're both against it. It's derivative. Right? No? No. No. It's derivative. Right? Right? And ultimately has led to idealism. Right? And we'll come back around to that too. I'll keep that. So we must, of course, guard against the misunderstanding of the expression sight. He doesn't leave any stone unturned, right? It corresponds to the clearness characterizing the disclosedness of the there, right? Seeing not only does not mean perceiving with the bodily eyes, neither does it mean the more non-sensory perception or of something objectively present in its objective presence. The only peculiarity of seeing, which we claim for the existential meaning of sight, is the fact that it lets beings accessible to it be encountered in themselves without being concealed. Of course, every sense does this within its genuine realm of discovery, but the tradition of philosophy has been primarily oriented from the very beginning towards seeing as the mode of access of beings and to being. To preserve this connection, one can formalize sight and seeing to the point of establishing a universal term which characterizes every access as access whatsoever to beings and beings. This is the history of Western philosophy, is the history of sight, from Plato to the present. Okay? You see in the realm outside the cave. You see reality. You see the world of knowledge, right? These are all part of the verbs of seeing, right? In terms of the history of Western philosophy. By showing how all sight is primarily based on understanding, the circumspection of taking care as understanding as comprehension. So understanding, right, one level of understanding is comprehension. This is interesting. You say you take your comprehensives, right, in graduate programs, right? The comprehensives is a derivative of understanding, right? Right? I understood, Professor, but you say I'm not comprehending. I think you're wrong because, yeah. Anyway, why they can't understand your work. You see? They only comprehend. They're derivatives, right? All right, okay. So we have taken away from mere intuition, pure anschauen, right? And mere intuition is the pure, right? The pure intuition. Its priority, which noetically corresponds to the traditional ontological priority of objective presence. So he's going into now the history of philosophy and trying to show, the verbs of sight and also the privileging, if you will, or the priority of intuition, intuitive grasps, right? Intuition and thought are both already remote derivatives of understanding. Okay? You don't have intuition without understanding. You can just say, I'm blessed with the sixth sense, I have great intuition. That's bullshit to Heidegger. This is, about understanding first and foremost. Even the phenomenological intuition of essences, this is a reference to Husserl, the Wesensschauer, right, is based on an existential understanding. He did not like this, Edmund Husserl. He thought this was a, bastardization of what he's doing, the intuition of essences, which goes all the way back to both the logical investigations, which if you ever have the time is worth, perusing. I don't know about long study. That's another lifelong project. But anyway, and also ideas towards a pure phenomenology. There's this other big book, the two big books. The book that launched, in my opinion, Derrida, two books that launched his philosophical career were The Origin of Geometry by Husserl, that study, and secondly of all, Chapter 6 of Logical Investigations, which is a chapter called Expression and Meaning, Chapter 6 of the Logical Investigation. And Voice and Phenomena, an early work of his, is a reading of Chapter 6 of the Logical Investigations. Okay? So, just so you know where he's coming from philosophically. Yeah. And why he says things, we have not exhausted the critical resources of Heidegger yet. This is why Derrida says these things. He's being very honest about this in his way. When he has an interview with Guy Scarpetta and what's his name? Scarpetta and Guy Risolto of the Communist Party. There's a very good interview with them in 1971 in a book called Positions, in which he talks about his relationship to Heidegger and the critical resources that it's left him. Yeah. He also goes through some very interesting things about Marx that we really need more intertextual reading of Marx. You know, Derrida speaks to this, to the theories of intertextuality, and also how has Marx been read in the tradition. We always have to know, how was it read through Lenin? How was it read through this person, et cetera, and what is the intertext always in terms of what we get and what prejudice do we bring to the reading, you know, which is interesting as well, yeah, in a way, yeah. So, all right, so the disclosedness, right, and anyway, is based on we can decide about what kind of scene only when we have obtained the explicit concepts of being and the structure of being, which only phenomena in the phenomenological sense can become. Okay? The disclosedness of the there in understanding, okay? The disclosedness of the there, it's not the best sentence, your English teacher will give you a bad grade for writing this way. In understanding is itself a mode of the potentiality of being of design, right? So again, the disclosedness of the there, right? Not the self, but of the there, the orientation, the movement. Yeah? Okay. Right? In the projectedness of its being upon for the sake of which, together with the projectedness of its own being upon significance world, lies the disclosedness of being in general. An understanding of being is already anticipated in the projecting upon possibilities. Being is understood in this project, but not ontologically grasped. Beings which have this kind of being of the essential project of being in the world as the constituent, of their being, the understanding of being. What we asserted earlier dogmatically is now demonstrated in terms of the constitution of the being in which Dasein, as understanding, is its there. In accordance with the limits of this whole inquiry, a satisfactory clarification of the existential meaning of this understanding of being can only be attained on the basis of a temporal interpretation of being, which we're going to get later. And again, if you want to footnote this or whatever, I do things like this because I read by analogy and where things are back and forth. You know, you compare this to section 68 of of later in Being and Time. I think this is page, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's. Yeah, 300 and
320.
yeah, 321. 320 and 321, temporality of understanding, and it goes on to the temporality. So you can, right there that you begin to see here, he's going to go there later, to, section 68, page 321, right? So anyway, as existentials, again, and remember on the original, chart mapping, if you will, I gave you, you have existentials and derivatives, right? We're talking about existential structure here. We're talking about a structural, analysis, right? As existentials, attunement and understand characterize the primordial disclosedness of being in the world. So we only need 2 moments, right, for this disclosedness at a primordial basis. Attunement, right? Some people say mood. I like attunement better, personally. Yeah. And the understanding. Yeah? So we have an economy of attunement, right? Not of an attention economy, but an attunement economy without understanding. Mm-hmm. So we don't even have primordial disclosedness. We have a symptom, of basically attunement, right? Economy, right? Without the understanding. I mean, in other words, digital culture, the technics in Stiglerian terms, etc. And you can see where Stigler gets a lot. I mean, there's a very long meditation on Heidegger here, into technics in time, and of course in states of shock, and the book we read, Symbolic Misery, and some of the other things we've engaged. It's a very long meditation by Stiegler on this passage as well, right? And today, the term attention economy, again, to me, an attention span, and these disorders, what do they call these disorders?
Attention deficit.
Attention deficit disorder. All this is about disclosedness and attunement, in my mind. So at least my understanding of this, and I think that radicalizes it to the point of where it can be treated on an existential level, and not just on the everyday stupid, DSM 3, 4, 5, whatever. Where's DSM now? 5?
5, at
Yeah,
least
okay.
5.
Yeah. I fit 31 categories in 3. We did
I
a
bailed
joke.
out
A
after the
group
last.
of friends were like, "Oh, you're in this category too. This category too." Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting they're revisiting all of the drugs that they've been giving people, the Prozac and...
Revisiting in the sense of reevaluating.
Yeah.
And what are they trying to evaluate? Whether they have any effect or
whether they have any long-term effect.
Uh-huh.
They say that in about 20% of the cases it has a short-term effect.
I see.
But there is no long-term effect.
Right.
You're talking about antidepressants or
Yeah, serotonin uptake inhibitors.
Oh, okay, yeah, it's different than the ADHD, Ritalin type.
Yeah,
stuff.
that's different.
So they speed up people so that they can focus.
Uh,
I mean, why would they give Ritalin, which
That's
is
what I
speed?
never
well,
understood either.
or modern versions of it. Well, actually, it allows children who are highly
No, I mean, I
distracted-
focused better. I took I took amphetamines
Yeah,
when,
I mean-
used to get through
But-
science classes through on amphetamines.
The question is,
Memorize everything the night before, stay up all night,
Oh, yeah.
take the test, and then crash for a day
Oh, it's
or
good.
two, right?
But you do it with kindergartens.
Yeah.
They'll learn sandbox very quickly.
Yeah. So is that the idea, that it helps you focus?
Well,
But you don't
the
retain
question is-
anything. I mean, I can't
Right.
remember the geological time scale or the,
No, but for small
the
children-
theoretical,
It's-
aspects of the physics.
Yeah.
Go ahead, I'm
But,
listening.
I mean, for
Yeah.
small children, is it the size of their problem, or is it the size of the class is too big and there's too much going on, so they, some children just can't focus. I mean, it's,
Right.
Well, it's engaging them too.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
If you can't engage
Yeah.
them.
What was the guy's name at Brooklyn College? He was very good. He used to have a radio program on Air America on Franken's network, where this person, Rachel Maddow, started off. And he had a lot. What was his name? Dr. Russell or something. I think he was Jamaican. Or
boy.
this guy was good. No, he was good. No, he was really good. He was really good. Yeah, he was really good on this stuff. He would come on late at night he had the program actually, and he had great discussions with Charles Barron around this. I'll remember his name. I think Russell is his name. I don't know, but he was a dean at Brooklyn College. He was very good on this Ritalin issue. So we're going to speed up the kids now. Make them more hyper. So they go.
No, actually, that has supposedly has a paradoxical effect.
Is that what they call it?
Well, they used to call
I
it
can
that.
hear the drug companies.
No,
Yeah.
they used to call it that because they claimed
Right.
that it would only have that effect on children who really had the diagnosis of ADHD.
Right.
Then they discovered it has the effect on everybody. So
Right,
there
I
goes
see.
the diagnosis.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting thing about this is that in Heidegger's case, I mean, if you're going to use this in terms of, the psychotherapeutic or the, everyday angst and these kind of things, is that this is very radical in the sense that it's putting aside all of those notions that without attunement and understanding, you're always dealing with a secondary, problem, right? Not the primary. So you have to attack at the level of both attunement and understanding, right? As primordial, disclosiveness, and this is really what it's about. And when you say something like class size, I think that's very important. I mean, if you have a class of eight kids in the kindergarten or 10 kids, it's very different than having 30 running around in terms of the energy flow, etc. Class size is one of the biggest things out there. You know, to me, it's more important than, I mean, everybody talks about access, but to me, the fundamental is curriculum and class size. These are the two things that have to be engaged, you know, if you're going to have any hope in this country. I think we're 33rd out of 35th of the advanced nations right now in terms of education. Yeah, 33rd out of 30. We're behind Norway. Remember you hear that Trump slip this week? Yeah. He
Norway?
said he called it Norway.
Oh,
In a meeting. Norway
Instead of
Norway.
Because,
God.
because of the shithole immigrants, that's
Right.
why.
He also thanked them for buying our.
No, he likes the people from the north.
That's what I'm
This is
saying.
the blonde beast at work.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm saying. The
No, he
reason
wants
why
more.
we're behind Norway is because of the shithole immigrants.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
We need
I got you.
more
Oh, I see.
Shithole.
Norway. I got you. I understand. That's very good on the slip.
But he thanked them for buying our F-52s.
Yeah, non-existent plane.
And the F-52 is only in the
Prototypical.
no,
system.
video game.
There's no such thing. It's in a video game. There's
Maybe he
no-
plays that at night.
I know.
Maybe that's one of his things he does at
He
night.
called it executive time now.
It's executive
Yeah, he
time?
doesn't come to work until 11 o'clock in the morning. So from, gets up and he.
Well, I don't blame him
walks in,
there.
he-
That's
he
not a
power
fault.
plays, he's-
Yeah.
Why work?
Maybe the system will crash. Maybe there'll be some kind of slip up and it'll collapse. You know.
Well, I mean, he really has done, in some ways, done people a favor in exposing the action. I mean,
Well, he's done the
Yeah.
top 1/3% who have 1/3 of the people who have pension funds and all this. I mean, the stock market, in terms of averages, is up over 40% in the past since he was elected in November of 2016. It's up over 40% on the Dow Jones Industrial Averages, and
Yeah.
similar almost for the NASDAQ and the S&P 500, which are maybe more relevant indexes at this point.
sure, and everybody's running around screaming bubble,
They've been screaming that since January last year,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
right? The bubble, right?
Yeah.
And you remember, the first night after the election, the market went down 1,000 points.
Right.
Yeah, but since then, yeah. I won't tell you what you could have made if you had bought at the low
Don't tell me.
and until Friday. But anyway, if you played the right derivatives. But anyway, yeah, we could have financed the revolution. That kind of time. We need that kind of disclosiveness for the not
We're
yet.
trying.
The not yet. Yes. Right. We're working on
I
it.
know.
We're going to work on it. Yeah. I'm thinking left hedge fund. Yeah.
That's what we said.
Yeah. Right.
We'll get there.
What's that? What happened?
We'll get there.
Wait for data.
What did you do? You put down some money on a house, or
No,
Oh,
he's
no.
waiting for. He's just giving me
Bitcoin?
shit. He's giving me shit that I'm not ready till the 11th of February.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay. All right. Let me just finish this section, and then we'll go on to the next one. Okay. As existentialists, attunement and understanding characterize the primordial disclosedness of being in the world. Last paragraph of the 143, second to last. In the mode of being attuned, Dasein sees possibilities in terms of which it is, right? In a way. So again, this is not an illusion, or fantasy, right? In some ways. It is part of your having beenness, right? Okay? In the projective disclosure of such possibilities, it is always already attuned. The project of its own almost possibility of being is delivered over to the fact of thrownness into the there. Okay? So you're thrown into the da. This is where you are. Da. You don't need the sign. The da. The thrownness is here. Then comes the sein, right? Thrown into the da. Right? The project, right, with the explication of the existential constitution of the being of the there in the sense of thrown project, does not the being of design still become more mysterious? Well, I don't think so. We must first let the full mysteriousness, and I love this German word, Ratschelhaftigkeit, right, of this being emerge. right? If only to be able to fail in a more genuine way in its solution and to raise the question anew of the being of throne projecting being in the world. Okay? So you have the Da, throne, projective, Sein, in the Welt. Right? All of this going on at once, right? And this is active. The hyphen means it's activity, right? You're in the process of being, right? As a participle. Okay? In order to sufficiently bring even only the everyday mode of being or of attuned understanding phenomenally to view, how do we bring it to view? And if this is to be sufficient for the full disclosiveness of the there, a concrete development of these existentials is necessary. So again, now we're going to go into the first, determination, interpretation, right? Interpretation and understanding, right? And this is where we get into the as structure, the foresight, the forehaving, right, etc. in this next section. Let me see if I can get some crucial passages here. Well, he has all the terms. In the second paragraph, the circumspect and the as structure are all problematized and discussed, right? And the end of the sentence, page 144, the end of the paragraph, the ontic inexplicitness of the as must not mislead us into overlooking it as the a priori existential constitution of understanding. So the as structure is very important as the a priori existential for understanding what something as is, right? Right? Okay, so maybe I should go back up. The as does not first show up in a statement, top of the page, but is only first stated, which is possible only because it is there as something to be stated. The fact that the explicitness of a statement can be lacking in simple looking does not justify us in denying every articulate interpretation and thus the as structure to this simple scene. The simple scene of things nearing to us in our having to do with contains the structure of interpretation so primordially that a grasping of something which is, so to speak, free of the as requires a kind of reorientation, okay? When we just stare at something, our just having it before us lies before us as a failure to understand it anymore, right? This grasping, which is free of the as, is a privation of simple seeing which understands. It is not more primordial than the latter, but derived from it. The ontic inexplicitness of the as must not mislead us, right, into overlooking it as the a priori existential constitution of understanding. Okay? Now, if any perception of useful things at hand always understands and interprets them, letting them be circumspectly encountered as something, does this not then mean that initially something merely objectively present is experienced, which is then understood as a door or as a house? Again, he's talking about how things unconceal or how things disclose themselves to us. James Joyce, for example, came to language through words to objects. Most people come to language through objects back to words. But for some reason, Joyce, interestingly enough, would have the word already there and then would attach it. But most people experientially come through the object. With a kid, you can work these kind of experiences. And, someone who's very good on this, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, I'm certainly, just don't have time for everything, but certainly interested in the acquisition of language. Merleau-Ponty has done some very good work on the child's acquisition of language. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, you know, if you want to look that up, whose wife was a psychoanalyst in the Lacanian school. And, you know, the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis in some ways is deeply indebted to the visible and the invisible of Merleau-Ponty. So Merleau-Ponty is engaging certain things here, you know, in this section in the work called The Visible and the Invisible. All right? Earlier in the phenomenology of perception, but much more Heideggerian in his later career before he died very early, 53 years old, 1961. But he, The Visible and the Invisible I recommend as a Heideggerian exercise into disclosiveness, called The Visible and the Invisible, and they're very brilliant discussions of dialectic. There's one section called Dialectic and Interrogation, on the interrogative dialectic in The Visible and the Invisible. So, yeah, anyway, so that it's a kind of reading, if you will. I mean, I'm reminded of it just by looking at this section. Yeah, The Visible and the Invisible. Yeah. It's one of his later works. It's notes, basically, that were put together in a book from a course. And this is where the Lacanian gaze kind of comes from, out of this work, the psychoanalytic gaze, and versus the look in Sartre. So, you know, you have these sections in the history of philosophy. This is why, again, look, fascist, National Socialist, Nazi, whatever, you know. To me, this does not, you know, begin to scratch the surface of how dense and how influential this book is, you know, in terms of modern, you know, especially continental philosophy. No question about it. Yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, you know, and even Dewey, Experience in Nature, even the title, Experience in Nature versus Being in Time, right? And what the stakes are, you begin to see this kind of step down, if you will, in terms of American pragmatism from this German, you know, intervention, right? Yes, indeed. Yeah, anyway, okay. So, all right, so, but if the perception of useful things always understands that letting things be circumstance encountered as something, does that mean initially something merely objectively present? Okay, this would be a misunderstanding of the specific disclosure function of interpretation. Second paragraph. Interpretation does not, so to speak, throw a significance over what is nakedly objectively present and does not stick a value on it, but what is encountered in the world is always already in a relevance which is disclosed in the understanding of world, a relevance which is made explicit by interpretation. Now, you know, going through these sections, he's going to go on to language here, you know, as the house of being. It is through language that we have access, ultimately, you know, somewhat to this being. So you can see he's building up towards that from understanding and interpretation on the way to language. All right? Things at hand are always already understood in terms of a totality of relevance. This totality need not be explicitly grasped by a thematic interpretation. Even if this totality of relevance has undergone such an interpretation, it recedes again into an undifferentiated understanding. It is precisely in this modality that it is the essential foundation of everyday circumspect interpretation. This is always based on the forehaving. As the appropriation of understanding and being that understands, the interpretation operates in being towards a totality of relevance which it has already been understand. When something is understood but still veiled, it becomes unveiled by an act of appropriation that is always done under the guidance of a perspective which fixes that with regard to which has been understood is to be interpreted. In each instance, the interpretation is grounded in a foresight that approaches what has been taken in forehanding with a definite interpretation in view. What is held in the forehanding and understood in a foreseen view becomes comprehensible through the interpretation. The interpretation can draw the conceptuality belonging to the beings to be interpreted from these themselves, or else the interpretation can force those beings into concepts to which they are opposed in accordance with their kind of being. The interpretation is always already decided finally or provisionally, upon a definite conceptuality, because it is grounded, if you will, in a foreconception, a Vorgriff. Yeah? Not conception, which is begriffen, but a foreconception of Vorgriffen. Right? It is no longer, it has not been grasped fully, taken hold of, as in a begriffen. It is a foreconception, for-conception, right? Anyway, right? The interpretation of something as something is essentially grounded, right, in forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Interpretation is never a and this is interesting because this is a meditation on what is interpretation. And for those of you that read Jameson, The Political Unconscious, especially the first chapter on interpretation, is a 90-page, political hermeneutic. Honestly, it's like he read this or he was in discussion with a lot of people. It is this very long, hermeneutic. It goes into structuralism. Obviously, the Althusserian problematic is there. But again, the interesting thing about Jameson's Political Unconscious, which I think was the end of the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, 79 or 80. Anyway, the interesting thing about that book is it opens up types of research temporally that one can rewrite, right, the dominant history. He's using this to rewrite dominant history. Right? Yeah. Okay? Interpretate, never a presuppositionalist grasping of something previously given. When a specific instance of interpretation, in the sense of a precise textual, appeals to what is there, then that which is initially is there is nothing other than the self-evident, undiscussed prejudice, right, of the interpreter, which necessarily lies in every interpretive approach as that which is already positive with interpretation in general, namely that which is pre-given in forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Okay? How are we to conceive the character of this fore? Right? So, we say very, cavalierly, we have foresight into something, we have some, foreconceptions too, before we say this in a way. He's looking, again, how do we conceive the character of this fore? Have we done this when we formally say a priori? Why is this structure appropriate to understanding, which we have characterized as a fundamental existential design? How is the structure of the as, which belongs to what is interpreted as such, related to the fore structure? This phenomena is obviously not to be dissolved into pieces, but is a primordial analytic to be reeled out. Should we accept such phenomena as finalities? Then the question would remain why? Or do, and this is the essential question, or do the fore structure of understanding and the as structure of interpretation show an existential, ontological connection with the phenomena of project? And does this phenomena refer back to a primordial constitution of the being of design? Before we'll answer these questions, the preparation up to now is not at all sufficient. We must inquire whether what is visible as the fore structure of understanding and the as structure of interpretation does not itself already represent a unitary phenomena which has been used extensively in philosophical problematics, without which what is used so universally measuring up to the primordiality of ontological explication. In the projecting of understanding, beings are disclosed in their possibility. The character of possibility corresponds to the kind of being of the beings understood. Interworldly beings in general are projected onto the world, that is, upon a totality of significance in whose referential relations, taking care, as being in the world, have rooted itself from the beginning. When interworldly beings are discovered along with the being of design, that is, when they become intelligible, we say they have meaning. But strictly speaking, what is understood is not the meaning, but beings or being. Meaning, right? Meaning is that wherein the intelligibility of something maintains itself. Okay? So what we sometimes take for meaning is not meaning to Heidegger. Right? It's only when we get the intelligibility of something that maintains itself. Right? that which can be articulated in disclosure, we must have disclosure, that understands we call meaning. Again, the use of the word transparency, and this guy's very good. He doesn't take this tack fully, but I'm just layering on to I'll bring the book next time. I really enjoyed reading it. I thought it was very clever, pressy. Again, we use the word transparency like it's going out of style. We're not using it in terms of real meaning. This is the problem, again, right? And, Chris, to go back to Derrida for a second, Derrida is throwing into question all of meaning, as you know, right? There's always going to be a slippage.
Yes.
Always a slippage here, a glissement, in language. So for Heidegger, the meaning is the intelligibility of something that maintains itself. Okay? So this is opening up all kinds of problems of what we call interpretation. How do we interpret? etc. And whole problem. And this opens up, again, I don't know how familiar you are with this, reader response criticism, Tompkins, Stanley Fish, is there a text in the class? The readings of the Yale School, the deconstructive, the psychoanalytic interpretation. This opens up a whole field of what reading is, right, in a way. The Althuserians, of course, with the notion of the symptomatic reading. And in a way, the symptomatic reading's coming out of this because this is a diagnostic, what he's doing here. He's really talking about the diagnostic of, where we are in 1927, right? This is why he's spending so much time on this. Yeah? The concept of meaning includes the formal framework of what necessarily belongs to what interpretation that undertakes articulates. Meaning, which is structured by, and this is interesting, you have to have a forehaving, a foresight, and a foreconception, is the upon which of the project in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. Insofar as understanding and interpretation constitute the existential constitution of the there, of the being of there, meaning must be conceived as the formal existential framework of the disclosedness belonging to understanding. Meaning is an existential in design, not a property that is attached to beings. It's not descriptive. Right? Which lies beyond them or floats somewhere as the realm between. And what is the third question? We've forgotten the meaning of being. Right? At the beginning of the treatise. Only Dasein has meaning in that the disclosiveness of the being in the world, a being in the world can be fulfilled through the beings discovered in it. Thus, only Dasein can be meaningful or meaningless. This means its own being and the beings disclosed with that being can be appropriated in an understanding, or they will be confined in incomprehensibility. It's pretty good on meaning here. And again, if you want to extend this at all, you can look at he's conservative, but he's very smart, Hans-Georg Gadamer's great book, masterpiece called Truth and Method, right? In which this is taken up in terms of meaning, right? And, I was one to get to disclose in this. Also, he wrote a very good book called Philosophical Hermeneutics, Gadamer, who was a student of Heidegger's. I have a wonderful photograph of Gadamer, Derrida, and Philippe Lacour-Labarthe at a Heidegger conference in the 1980s. And Gadamer is you can see the open being, right? I mean, they're all there. Derrida's got a kind of smirk and, very open, but, kind of half smirk on his face. And you kind of see the profile of Philippe Lacour-Labarthe, who was one of the first generations of the Derridians who died early, prematurely. But, very, very smart guy. You know Lacour-Labarthe's work on German Romanticism, the literary absolute. Very, very good work on the Schlegel brothers, to the avant-garde of Germany.
But he was in der Erste.
Strasbourg. He was the Strasbourg school.
He was in der Erste.
He was in der Erste. He smokes, constantly smokes. Yeah, he's a chain smoker. Yeah. He ended up at Berkeley, and he died out there. And Jean-Luc Nancy, they lived together in the same house with their wives in Strasbourg. And then they got tired of their respective wives, so they switched wives. It's a true story. They had the school in Strasbourg. Yeah, this was there, but very first-rate people. Yeah, first-rate. Not seeing the movie. Yeah, they switched wives.
Yeah,
It was
I
a
think that was what
hermeneutic. It
happened.
was what? I'm sorry.
I think wives switch to the husband.
Yes.
That's probably true.
Right.
That's good. That's well put.
They got
Yes, that's
tired.
all.
Yeah.
Well, I have masculinist tendencies. I mean, even though I believe in the world is feminine. Right. Anyway, so yeah. Claire Denis wrote the book on. I did a film on Jean-Luc Nancy. It's had 5 heart transplants, and I forgot the name of the film. You know the film, right? She wrote Claire Denis, the great French film director, who's done a lot of work on immigrant labor. I mean, there should be a festival for Claire Denis now because she's really good on the immigrant question in Europe. I mean, she's first rate on this. The Unthawed or something like that. It's really about Nancy's encounters with his multiple heart transplants and is almost dying each time. He's still alive. Yeah. Yeah. The best book I ever read on Descartes called Ego Sum. It's in French. And he wrote another very good book on the categorical imperative. Little technical studies, but he's very, very, very sharp. Yeah. Anyway, so yeah. So enough of those people. But anyway, this interpretation of the concept of meaning is fundamentally ontological existential. If we adhere to it, all beings whose mode of being is unlike design must be understood as unmeaningful, as essentially bare of meaning. Unmeaningful does not mean here a value judgment. This is interesting, but it expresses an ontological determination. And only what is unmeaningful can be absurd. Objectively, present things encountered in design can, so to speak, assault its being. For example, events of nature which break in on us and destroy us. Okay? And when we ask about the meaning of being, our inquiry does not become profound and does not brood on anything which stands behind being, but questions being itself insofar as it stands within the intelligibility of design. The meaning of being can never be contrasted with beings or with being as the supporting ground of beings, for ground is only accessible as meaning, even if that meaning itself is an Abgrund or an abyss of meaninglessness. So the Abgrund, the abyss itself, has meaning as well as an ontological determination. And this is where Heidegger's operating from, in my opinion. Yeah. Okay? As the disclosiveness, and I'm sorry I'm spending so much time on this, but I think this is very important for, all the work that's been done in the last, 60 to 80 years in terms of language and language theory. And, this has a very long history. The next section on statement is very important, I think, politically, because we're always engaged in the left only in statement. It's kind of interesting. We'll go over that too. And he goes through many levels of this too. Okay, when we ask about the meaning of being, we went on about this. As the disclosiveness there, understanding always concerns the whole of the being in the world. And in every understanding of world, existence is also understood and vice versa. So every interpretation operates within the force structure. Now, if education would start thinking about from K, pre-K on the way up, about force structure, right, we might get somewhere. We don't think this way. We think plan. We think lesson plan. We think accumulation of knowledge. We think teaching to the test, preparation for the test, all these kind of things. We don't think about forehaving and force structure, ever, or foresight. Any of these 4 categories are not really being thought through, right? Okay? And he says, every interpretation which is to contribute some understanding must already have understood what it is to be interpreted. The fact has always already been noticed, even if only in the realm of derivative ways of understanding interpretation, and now he's going to take on the philologist and philological interpretation. The latter belongs to the scope of scientific cognition. Such cognition demands the rigor of demonstration giving reasons. Scientific proof must not must not already presuppose what its task is to found, but if interpretation always already has to operate within what is understood and nurture itself from this, how then should it then produce scientific work results without going in a circle, especially when the presupposed understanding still operates in the common knowledge of human being and world? So, what he's doing here is he's trying to set up the hermeneutical circle, right? This is really the goal of this section. The understanding, the four structures, right? The four conceptions, etc. How are we going to set up this hermeneutical circle as our dominant mode of interpretation, right? But according to the most elementary rules of logic, the circle is a vicious circle. If this is so, then the business of historical interpretation is thus banned a priori from the realm of rigorous interpretation, knowledge. If the fact of the circle is understood, if the fact of the circle in understanding is not eliminated, historiography cannot be content with less rigorous possibilities, must be content with less rigorous possibilities of knowledge. It is permitted to compensate for this defect to some extent with the spiritual significance of its objects. He's going after here is Dilthey, Wilhelm Dilthey's, on the understanding and in the social sciences, right? Right? It is permitted to compensate for this defect to some extent with the spiritual significance of its objects. But even according to the opinion of historiographers themselves, it would be more ideal if the circle could be avoided and if there were the hope of finally creating a historiography which is as independent of the standpoint of the observer as the knowledge of the nature is supposed to be. Okay? So here we have this notion of the quote-unquote, non-prejudiced observer, right? That position, right? But to see a vitiosum in the circle and to look for ways to avoid it, even to feel that it is an inevitable imperfection, is to misunderstand understanding from the ground up. It is not a matter of assimilating understanding and interpretation to a particular idea of knowledge, which is itself only a degeneration of understanding and is strayed into the legitimate task of grasping what is objectively present in its essential intelligibility. Rather, the fulfillment of the fundamental conditions of possible interpretation lies in not failing to recognize beforehand the essential conditions of its task. What is decisive is not to get out of the circle, but to get into it the right way. This is crucial for Heidegger, right? Not to get outside of the circle, but to enter the circle the right way. This circle of understanding is not a circle in which any random kind of knowledge operates, but is rather the expression of the existential four-structure of Dasein itself. The circle must not be degraded to a vitiosum, not even to a tolerated one. A positive possibility of the most primordial knowledge is hidden in it, which, however, is only grasped in a genuine way when interpretation is understood that its first, constant, and last task is not to let forehaving, foresight, and foreconception be given to it by chance ideas and popular conceptions, but to secure the scientific theme by developing these in terms of the things themselves. What is under investigation? The things themselves, right? This battle cry of phenomenology back to the things themselves. And this is what, was part of the attraction again to Heidegger, was this kind of return to the philosophy of concreteness, right? Right? Philosophy of the everyday, of the concrete, right? All right? So, because, in accordance with its existential meaning, understand is the potentiality for being of Dasein itself. The ontological presuppositions of historical knowledge transcend in principle the idea of the rigor of the most exact sciences. Mathematics is not more exact than history, but only narrower with regard to the scope of the existential foundations relevant to it. So that's a pretty radical statement there. Mathematics is not more exact than history, but only narrower with regard to the scope of the existential foundation relevant to it. So that's a good book project, The Existential Foundations of the Mathematical.
So what would Badiou say to that then?
He would disagree.
Yeah.
For Badiou, the divided line, the mathematical understanding, and the mathematical ontology is the founding, ontology of existence. But in some ways, that can lead into, in some ways, I mean, Heidegger's being can lead into an onto-theological, moment. But Badiou, in another way, can lead into onto-theological if God, who is the spirit of the geometer in the 17th century, the clockmaker in the 18th century, and now is the elaborate mathematical formula of the universe, and the mathematization of nature has taken its course, right? Does this not, again, put us in the realm of a new kind of theology?
Yeah.
So this is always this kind of problem. Yeah,
Somewhere Heidegger
So
says-
Badiou would, yes, because for let me just point this out really quickly. For Descartes, at the bottom, the new foundation is the Universalis Mathesis. And as I mentioned to you, mathesis in Greek really means learning. If you do your mathemata, that's your lesson in Greek, right? The mathesis itself is really the universal learning. But it's also based on the foundation of the mathematical rigor and certainty, right? So this quest for certainty takes place in the 17th century. For Heidegger, this is ontic. And it's actually something that is part of the foundation that needs to be shaken by fundamental ontology. For Badiou, who's French and comes up in the Cartesian tradition, he's going to go back in some ways and bring in a kind of Cartesian, it's a strange mix, a Cartesian, Althusserian, Lacanian, Sartreanism, with a long history of engaging number and mathematics, back into the equation of where he wants to universalize and build the foundation on a new kind of ontological, ground of mathematics. Again, to reorient, if you will, on that basis, right? So for Heidegger, the opposition here is more about, poiesis, right? The poetic and the creativity versus the mathesis, right? Or the mathematical, right? Or the mathematical. So you have the struggle, which you have already in Plato, between the poets who are excluded, right? But at the same time, the epistemology that remains, because the poets cannot do knowledge, right? They don't have knowledge. This is why they're excluded. They also live in the realm of appearance, right? They work with mimesis. They actually speak to the worst part of the soul, the appetitive, the passions, right, etc., right? And Plato wants these people cast out of the Republic. This is both Book 3 and Book 10. Book 3 has the censorship in the Republic. Book 10 in has basically the exclusion and why they're excluded. Because mathesis, objectively speaking, has no ability to be mimetically, cannot be imitated, right? So poetry becomes an imitative art, right? And then so for Badiou, Heidegger may be succumbing still in Platonic materialist, in his language, I'm using his language, in Platonic materialist, he is falling to a mimetic fallacy.
I see. Right,
in some ways. He is making based on imitation, right? And is not getting to, quote, pure, aruthmos number.
It's interesting.
Pure number, right? In some ways.
But
So
Heidegger would say there is none.
that he would say that. He would say this is also part of the scientific project, which
Right.
is still, in a way,
Right.
part of the things that are, present to hand.
I remember Heidegger
Objectively,
said somewhere
yeah.
that he was criticizing formal logic, and he said that the problem of formal logic is that by the time you begin thinking about a problem, you kind of already know the answer. You just have to find it. You just have to so in other words, that it's forecloses thinking. That's why there's no
Yes.
thinking.
Well, that's
There's
another,
knowledge.
that's the thing with mathematics too,
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
much
yeah,
less
yeah.
creative than
Yeah.
the mathematicians think, because they already have such rigorous kind of narrowing of
Right.
the way they're reasoning, that this is permitted, that's not permitted, this is permitted, right? That it becomes foreclosed much more than open, and sort of Heidegger's notion of
Right.
uncovering
Right.
or
Yeah, I mean, this gets very sophisticated in terms of, discussions about the logic of paradox, the logic of incommensurability, the logic of, the
Who's the kind of
undecidable.
incommensurability? Like, who would be some of the?
Well, certainly Gödel, Kurt Gödel, right? And then you have a whole tradition of mathematicians that Heidegger does not really engage, that the Badiou does, which is the French tradition of Évariste Galois, and of course all the way up through Poincaré, right? And in mathematics you have intuitionism, you have schools, intuitionism, essentialism, you have many schools, mathematical formalism, and one of the masters here, by the way, again, someone that hasn't been translated or really written about in the United States, but he's very, very crucial to Alain Badiou and also to Georges Canquillon, as well as another tradition in French philosophy, the more rationalist tradition against the existentialist and Marxist tradition, the kind of continuation of French rationalism. And this is Jean Cavalet, who died in combat, a Marxist, right, who wrote the book, wrote the essay, The Dialectic of the Concept. I wrote a very good article. That is available, by the way. I think I can find, or Arto could find it if I can't find it in English. Yeah. I have his book on the theory of the logic of science, but it's only available in private. Beautiful first edition, that I protect. I have it wrapped in nice paper and all this. Yeah. Anyway, so he's interested and very influential on Badiou. But within mathematics, just to be fair to the mathematicians, I mean, if you will, I mean, that there are debates about mathematics, which you talked about, formal logic. There's a debate between the formalist and the intuition. And what is number is the question. What is arithmos? Arithmetic is from the Greek word arithmos, which means number, literally means number. Right? And you have theories of number abound in, and one of the great books on this too is written by Jakob Klein, who came to the United States. This is available in English, on the Greek notion of the mathematical. I think it's called The Origin of Greek Mathematics, and and then there's Thomas Heath, The History of Greek Mathematics. So in some ways, Heidegger wants to return through the poetics, right, and the creativity, right, of the poetics, right, in a way, and the ancient battle between the poets and the philosopher, for him, is a confrontation between Hölderlin and Hegel, right? In some ways, this German Romantic period, right? This is a part of where he's thinking, right? And certainly Nietzsche, who's a very poetic writer. Nietzsche is not, although I will say for Nietzsche, he wanted to have eternal recurrence of the same, mathematized. He went to the university and brought the eternal recurrence of the same and said, please mathematize this. And so
but his sections in the Will to Power on mathematics and formal logic are extremely rigorous.
Yes.
It kind of reads like Wittgenstein.
Yes. Right.
Yeah. I mean,
Right,
have this
but we can go there later. I mean, I think it's important to kind of grasp what Heidegger is up to here. But yes, it is very different. I mean, you bring up a good, the Badiou is a very different moment, even though Badiou is very well aware, and I said this in a group, I mean, Alain Badiou is kind of the creature that Marx had in mind, in terms of the total intellectual, because he has a background, mathematics, science to a degree, certainly poetry, philosophical rigor, the political, all of these things are operative in film, art, painting, music. Not that he's great at all of these, but he has an ability to almost engage at all these levels, from everything from Mallarmé's poetry to Wagner to, to modern art and, et cetera.
So the sort of forehaving of Badiou in his project of mathematical ontology would be then essentially communism? Is this sort of like the idea? You know, the project, essentially. Why does he look at mathematics, for instance, as an ontology? Or to end up with, you know, I don't know. Maybe my question doesn't make sense.
I guess I don't understand.
We can move
I mean,
on.
for Badiou, communism is a hypothesis.
Right
now. That what we're witnessing right now, according to Badiou, and I'm certainly of this school, that we're just so weak as opponents.
Right.
That's why this is happening. There's no opposition. You know, the opposition is so weak globally. I mean, even though there are a few things here and there, the reason this goes on is because they're saying. So to talk about communism, other than a hypothesis, right, is a kind of misnomer at this point, because the opposition in terms of creating the conditions for that to come is another question.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, do you mean, ultimately, a communism could be, you know, perfect number,
Right.
rhythm, these kind of things that you would really have this.
I guess
I
that
always
was my
use
point.
examples like the Mingus Orchestra
Right.
is a kind of, you know, play of, you know, harmony, melody, counterpoint, all of these elements in musical theory, which kind of come together, and everybody is equal, you know, and it puts together a totality of engagement and creativity,
Yeah.
and that to me is exemplary of a kind of communism to come.
Right.
You know, or it could be a model at
Right.
one level.
I guess
Right,
model, yeah.
and music to me, in a sense, also, you know, in the Platonic sense, that was the foundation of education, musica, and of which mathematics is a part, right? Poetry was not, it was part of it, the epic poetry, but it was not part of the academy in terms of the absolute entry point. The entry point to the academy, those who know the spirit of geometry can enter. Those that know geometry. Let no one who does not know the geometer cannot enter the academy. That was a condition in that time. And you have to remember, the dialogues that Plato is having, you know, again, this is within the, you know, for the historians of philosophy, that the dialogues were really with, you know, Pythagoras and the Pythagorean schools, of which one school was music, the acoustica, yeah, right? And the other were the mathematica. Those were the two schools of Pythagoras. Those who heard, and were called the musica, you know, the musical Pythagoreans, and then the mathematical Pythagoreans. Plato, in some senses, tries to bring two together because music contains mathematics, right? I mean, you know, within it, right? But he still is more interested in this. So in some ways, I mean, the base for Plato is also mathematics and music, you know, and you never hear Heidegger, but Heidegger in a way is trying to build some kind of rhythm here. I mean, I don't know what the comparable, I mean, certainly there are elements of Beethoven here in terms of the resounding, you know, repetitive, you know, you know, you can try to think of it that way, you know, in some ways, but
It's interesting because I forget who wrote as a critique of Plato, sort of excluding poetry and poetics, you know, but you know, in music, maybe this was the case with ancient Greek music because we don't have a recorded representation of it. We don't really know how it sounded, but music is a combination of math and poetics because the notion of, for example, in Mingus, you know, you have the sort of the mathematical elements, like the proportions of the, you know, that you have the head in the song, and then you have the solos and whatever, and then the refrains. But the solos are essentially, you know, open-ended potentially. Or right. So in other words, that's the poetic element of, or in Beethoven, or I guess you're asking like in classical sonata form, right?
Yes.
Which is like the 19th century formal structure. The most interesting thing is in the development section of the sonata, where, you know, what's prized is that Beethoven takes unanticipated turns in the harmony, right? It's like he was supposed to go from this chord to this chord according to this formal structure, but Beethoven doesn't go to that chord, and Beethoven goes to a totally different chord, right? And everyone was like shocked, and people like walked out of concerts, you know, kind of like in Mingus's day or in Sun Ra's day, you know. So in that sense, the modulation is the fundamental concept in sort of creativity in music. Like, you were supposed to go here according to the structure, but you didn't. Or it took you these other ways to get to the expected mathematical structure.
Right,
You know? So
right.
this became sort of like the big point in at least I guess in this European music or in jazz. You know,
Mhm.
like you know, in Coltrane, giant steps. You know, you're not supposed to move in chords by thirds. This was the technical term,
Right,
right? So you're
right.
supposed to move in a different chord progression, but Coltrane moved in thirds, descending thirds. And people were like, "That's so shocking," you know. But that was the poetic moment, right? That's not the theory didn't account for that. You know, it was like that's not possible.
Mhm.
And then it became possible after the sort of Coltrane sort of like uncovering, like he made it work, and then the theorists
Right.
were like, "Oh yeah, it's moving in thirds." And, you know, now we
Right.
study it in schools, like you know, the
Right.
Coltrane giant steps
Right.
progression. You know, kind of.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, going back to what Josh said, you know, I mean, part of the thing with Badiou and the communist hypothesis is he does try to use set theory to try to explain
Right.
the Cultural Revolution,
Right.
you know, in some ways.
Yeah.
To explain it or to show what went wrong.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, this is the, you know, both as an
I see.
explanatory, you know, a diagnostic model as well as maybe a prescriptive
Mhm.
model. The
Okay.
thing about this is, I mean, I think unsurpassed as diagnostic for the time in philosophy. The question is, what is the prescriptive? Does this have an ethics to it? Because
Right.
he never wrote an ethics. The question would be for us, can we get an ethics out of this? Someone like you know, or an ethos for the left.
Yeah.
Right? In some ways. This is always the question when you bring up a book of this magnitude. Does it have an ethos, right, in terms of what we can work with? Or are the elements there to work with, you know, in terms of a you know, a kind of new political formation, or to really learn what was lost in the past? Yeah.
Yeah, for
I mean,
sure.
this conservative revolution was very powerful.
Yeah.
When you read people like Schmidt, Junger, Heidegger, who I consider the big three. There are other ones, right? But those are the big three in a sense. They never referred to themselves as that, but I refer, and other people, you know, refer to them as that. You see some real power of thinking going on here, and something that in a lot of ways, at least at the ideological level, has won, you know, in many ways, you know, has won in terms of authenticity, right? You know, it's not about socialization of
That's true.
resources, socializations of losses. It's certainly not about the politics of victimhood and straightening that out. There was never any talk of equality. You know, I mean, these are questions that, you know, we have to pose
Right.
as well, you know, going forward.
good
On
point.
the other hand, what is the possibility, you know, because the Marxist tradition never really dealt with the self, never really dealt with the politics of care and the self. I mean, it forayed, as we know, with Reich and others into psychoanalysis and, you know, psychotherapy, and there were many left attempts to integrate Marx and Freud together, right?
Yeah.
You know, but ultimately it didn't really gel. I mean, you know, there was always that problem, right? And so, yeah. Because see, for Heidegger, when Marx would say social relations determine consciousness, he would say, fine, that's ontic, you know, and that's consciousness, right? Right? For him, it's not it's not the ontological, right, in a certain way. And I'm sure, you know, Badiou would say the same thing in a certain way. You know? And again, the set theory is where he's really coming. You know, he's coming out of this tradition of Dedekind and you know, Piano and you know, this group around you know, modern set theory. He sees that as the base of ontology.
Right.
Being is set theory.
Yeah. I mean, I think my question was a little
The sets of
reductionistic,
sets.
but I think you answered it.
No, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's hard. No, I don't know. It's hard to know because I
Yeah.
think we're in a position where we have to problematize around stuff like that,
Yeah.
rather than a direct answer. I mean, you know,
Yeah.
it's kind of difficult because
No, I know.
You know, Badiou is about the set of sets.
Yeah.
You know, Heidegger, the being of beings, but you know, but being is being crossed out constantly, and this is the thing Derrida does very well in terms of the eraser. He gets this from Heidegger. He's seeing the crossings in Heidegger's, you know, when he's writing on the question of being with Junger, which is thing. I think I have a copy of it in German. I don't think it's been translated into English. You know, the question of being, where he and Junger are on the line. and they talk about whether they should cross the line. Heidegger says, no, we must study it. Junger's ready to cross, right? It's kind of interesting. Of course, this is the Maginot line, where all the fire is, and the firepower. So anyway, let's go back to the anyway. So you can see again, this vicious circle in mathematics is not more, but only narrow. So this is a good sentence to work with, I think. Okay, and I'll be in touch about all this stuff. And if you can get that thing scanned and get it to me, because that's going to be a project. Yeah, I'll call you tomorrow and give your son our best for his happy birthday. What's he, 4 this year?
No, it's my friend, my best friend.
Oh, your best friend. Oh, I thought it was your
my
son.
My son will be 4 in late August.
Oh, yeah, that's what I thought. I didn't think I brought you. I thought I brought you a cigar in the summer. I was wondering. I didn't bring him a cigar in the winter. I was wondering. I thought you said it was your son's birthday. Okay. All right, let's go down. The circle, again, this is on the circle and understanding, belongs to the structure of meaning, right? And then this phenomena is rooted in the existential constitution of Dasein, that is, in interpretive understanding. Beings which, as being in the world, are concerned about their being itself, have an ontological structure of the circle. However, if we note that the circle belongs ontologically to a kind of being of objective presence, subsistence, we shall in general have to avoid characterizing something like Dasein ontological in terms of this phenomena. Okay? So here he is kind of previewing this whole notion of the hermeneutical circle, and he is also getting away, and you can see it in the footnote, and this is important too, and we'll come back to this as we get deeper into this, representational thinking. How does one get outside of representational thinking? And for Heidegger, representational thinking is still operative in science. Right? It's the era of representational thinking. Right? And we'll see that in the question concerning technology as well. Okay, now the next several sections, and it depends on how long you guys want to go. It's 5 o'clock. Is really 5 sections from 33 to 6 through 38. But the main thing is the language. So let's go through statement first as a derivative mode of interpretation. It's not primary statement. So political statements, like we get today, if you want to read the political hermeneutic into this, is all derivative. It does not have that force of meaning that he's looking for. So statement number 1, you could say, means pointing out. Right? And what is discovered for sight is not a meaning, but a being in the mode of its being at hand. So this is under number 1, under statement on page 149. 2, statement is tantamount to predication. A predicate is stated about a subject. Trump is a moron. Right? The latter is determined by the former. What is stated in this signification of statement is not the predicate, but that the hammer itself, Trump himself. Right? What does this stating, that is the determining, on the other hand, lies in the too heavy, the moron. What was stated in the second signification of statement, what is determined as such, has been narrowed down in its content as opposed to what is stated in the first signification of the term. Every predication is what it is only as a pointing out. Right? Again. Right? The elements which are articulated in predication, subject, predicate, originate within the pointing out. Okay? So this is an analysis of what is a statement. What is a statement? Determining does not first discover, but as a mode of pointing out, initially limits seeing precisely to what shows itself, that is the hammer, or Trump as such, in order to manifest explicitly what is manifest in its determinacy through the explicit limitation of looking. When confronted with what is already manifest with a hammer which is too heavy, determining must take a step back. First take a step back. Positing the subject dims beings down to a focus on the hammer there in order to let what is manifest be seen in its determinable, definite character through this dimming down. I guess this is why I like the dark. Right? Positing the subject, positing the predicate, and positing them together are thoroughly apophantic in the strict sense of the word. Okay? Statement, thirdly, means communication. that is speaking forth. So you have pointing out, right? Predication, and now communication, right? Okay? So anyway, he goes on down. Statement, he redefines page 151, just to move along a little bit. And please, take your time and read this carefully, because again, a crucial section, to my mind, something very undervalued in Heidegger and under-theorized. When we collect the 3 meanings of statements, page 51, analyzed here in a unitary view of the complete phenomena, the definition reads, statement is pointing out which communicates and defines. Now we must ask, what right do we have at all to conceive the statement as a mode of interpretation? If it is something of this sort, the essential structures of interpretation must be repeated in it. The statement's pointing out is accomplished on the basis of what is already disclosed in understanding or what is circumspectly discovered. The statement is not an unattached kind of behavior which could of itself primarily disclose beings in general, but already maintains itself on the basis of being in the world. What we showed earlier with regard to knowing the world is just as true of the statement. It needs a forehaving of something disclosed in general, which it points out in the mode of determining. Furthermore, when one begins to determine something, one has a directed viewpoint with respect to what is to be stated. In the act of determining something, the function of determining is taken over by that with regard to which beings that have been presented or envisioned. Thus, the statement needs a foresight as well, in which the predicate that is to be delineated and attributed is itself loosened, so to speak, from its implicit enclosure in the being itself. So both a forehaving and a foresight. These are conditions, right? A significant articulation of what is pointed out always belongs to the statement as communication that defines, and it operates within a definite set of concepts. The hammer is heavy. Heaviness belongs to the hammer. The hammer has the property of heaviness. The foreconception always also contained in the statement remains mostly inconspicuous because language always already contains a developed conceptuality. Like interpretation in general, the statement necessarily has its existential foundations, right, in forehaving, foresight, and foreconception. Okay? All right? So he goes on at the bottom of the next paragraph. On the circumspectly spoken interpretation is not necessarily a statement in the sense defined. Through what existential ontological modifications does the statement originate from circumspect interpretation? So he goes on to the primordiality of the as on the next page and the structure of the logos. So again, the statement, right, he's going all the way back to Aristotle to get what we ultimately say is a proposition, right? This is coming from a reading, if you will, of Aristotle's categories and propositions, and how is he going to, ontological ground itself, right? So anyway, let me go forward here. On page 153, there are many interim stages between an interpretation that's wrapped up in a heedful understanding and the extreme case, opposite case of a theoretical statement about objectively present things. Statements about events in the surrounding world, descriptions of what is hand, reports on situations, noting and ascertaining a factual situation, describing a state of affairs, telling about what's happened. These sentences cannot be reduced to theoretical propositional statements without essentially distorting their meaning. Like the latter, they have their origin in circumspect interpretation. So this is good reportage, if you would. Circumspect interpretation could be considered good reportage, if you would. Okay? With the progress of knowledge about the structure of the logos, it is inevitable that this phenomenon of the apophanical as came to view in some form. The way in which it was initially seen is not a matter of chance, nor did it fail to have its influence on the history of logic to come. When considered philosophically, logos itself is a being, and in accordance with the orientation of ancient ontology, something that is present. That's reason, or giving an account of. The word logos has gone through many interpretations or many meanings, but literally logos, means giving an account of. Or, in other words, reason to reason. It did not become word until the Christian era. The Christians fucked up everything. Excuse my language to any Christians that may watch YouTube. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm heartily offended.
Yes, you're heartily offended. Yes, right. Yeah, you had a forehaving of that. Huh?
Right, exactly. No kidding.
So, anyway, it's very important to remember that logos really is to give an account of something. Yeah. That's what reason does. It gives accounts of something, right? In the Greek sense, in the strong Greek sense of the word, right? Go back. And logos is at the top of the movement towards the good in Plato's Republic. Logos is giving an account of reason. Reason and dialectic work hand in hand. And if you read Nietzsche on the problem of Socrates, you will see the birth of dialectics according to Nietzsche. And Socrates gave the rabble the ability to speak. Adorno doesn't mention that part. Yeah. Nietzsche did. Yeah, anyway. Okay, so reportage, okay, what is initially present, that is, which can be found like things, are the words and the successions of words in which the logos is spoken. When we first look for the structure of the logos, thus present, we find a being present together of several words. What constitutes the unity of this together? As Plato knew, it consists in the fact that the logos is always logos tinos. With regard to the beings manifest in the logos, the words are combined to form one totality of words. Aristotle had a more radical view. Every logos is synthesis and diaresis, right? So logos is actually synthetic activity. You begin to see that. That's the Greek word for synthesis, right? And diaresis. Neither the one, say, as a positive judgment, nor the other as a negative judgment. Rather, every statement, whether affirmative or negative, whether false or true, is equipped with primordially both synthesis and diaresis. Pointing out is putting together and taking apart. However, Aristotle did not pursue this analytical question further to the problem. What phenomena is it then within the structure of logos that allows us and requires us to characterize every statement as synthesis and diaresis? This is very interesting on propositional logic. Arto's left, we could have, had a little discussion about, but anyway, we can always go back to it. What is to be got at phenomenally, with the formal structures of binding and separating, more precisely with the unity of the two, is the phenomena of something as something. In accordance with this structure, something is understood with regard to something else. It is taken together with it, so that this confrontation that understands, interprets, and articulates, and at the same time takes apart what has been put together. If the phenomena of the as is covered over and is above all veiled in its existential origin from the hermeneutical as, then Aristotle's phenomenological point of departure disintegrates into the analysis of logos in a superficial theory of judgment. This is very intelligent, I promise you. I mean, when you really begin to think about this, what he's really doing here is he's taking away the capacity, really, for elementary value judgments, or for us to make judgments without understanding synthetic and diaretic activity in terms of how propositions come to be made, how statement comes to be made, right? Right? To which judgment is a binding or separating of representations and concepts, right? Binding and separating can be further formalized to mean a relating. The judgment is dissolved logistically into a system of coordinations. It becomes the object of calculation, but not a theme for ontological interpretation. The possibility and impossibility of the analytical understanding of synthesis and diathesis, or relation, is the judgment in general is closely bound up with the actual state of the fundamental ontological problematic. To what extent this problematic has an effect on the interpretation of the logos, and on the other hand, to what extent the concept of judgment has, by a remarkable counter-movement, an effect on the ontological problem, is shown by the phenomena of the copula, the is, right? It becomes evident in this bond that the structure of synthesis is initially posited as a matter of course, and that it has maintained the decisive interpretive function. But if the formal characteristics of relation and binding cannot contribute anything phenomenally to the factual structural analysis of the logos, the phenomenon intended with the term copula finally has nothing to do with bond and binding, whether expressed explicitly in language or indicated in the verbal ending. The is and its interpretation are moved into the context of the problems of the existential analytic of being, of Dasein itself. This development of the question of being, division 3 of part 1, will then encounter again the peculiar phenomena of being within the logos. For the time being, we want to clarify, with this demonstration of the derivation of the statement from interpretation and understanding, the fact that the logic of logos is rooted in the existential analytic of Dasein. Recognizing the ontologically insufficient interpretation of the logos at the same time sharpens our insights into the lack of primordiality of the methodological basis on which ancient philosophy developed. The logos is experienced as something objectively present, interpreted as such, and the beings which it points out have the meaning of objective presence as well. This meaning of being itself is left undifferentiated and uncontrasted with other possibilities being, so that being in the sense of a formal being something is at the same time fused with it, and we're unable to attain a clear-cut division between these two realms. So Aristotle messed us up in terms of propositional logic. Yeah, I mean, so this is, yeah. How do we come to value judgments, right? And what Heidegger's really talking about, synthesis, by the way, means coming together, right? Coming together. And he's going to go back to this little word of the copula, the is. Always the is.
That's where Derrida attacks him.
In what essay is this? Philosophy Before Linguistics?
Well, he
goes through Aristotle there.
He says that the copula, which is the basis for all being in Heidegger, is merely language.
Well, language is the house of being. I don't know if, being is language, but anyway.
The word is the copula.
Okay, the primary word, okay. Yeah, I'll have to take a look at that essay again. I know the essay. I thought that the essay was really to take a look at Aristotelian categories and propositions, right? Doesn't it kind of undoes the copula vis-a-vis
I'll
that?
have to look
and
for
it's
it again.
Emile Bonfanice's use of Aristotle's categories?
No, I don't think.
It's not,
I don't
it's not
remember, but I don't
Bonfanice,
think
the
so.
linguist, the great linguist? Yeah, okay. All right. Well, I'll go back to that. I mean, we'll look at that too. Yeah, in a way. But Heidegger is not saying, I mean, essentially, yes, we are language, we are the speaking subject. That's what we are. Which is also true for Saussure and other linguists. But Heidegger's building, yeah. I mean, his great proposition was language is the house of being. Lacan, the unconscious, is structured, not as a language, but is structured like a language. So you have structure of language, house of being, these are the kind of things, yeah. Okay, I'll go back. No, I'm glad you brought that up. I forgot about it. I mean, I know the essay. I really thought it was an investigation of Aristotle.
I think it's in De la Grammatologie.
No, it may be in there, but It's also in Margins of Philosophy. It's a big essay in Margins of Philosophy. Yeah. Okay, so this is, again, the breakdown of statement and proposition by Heidegger in this section 33. And again, I mean, I know we're not going to cover every little element of it, but we can certainly go back to it. So the next part is really language, right? The appropriation, right, of what is, what discourse is, right? Dasein and discourse, and i.e. language. And he defines discourse. Discourse is the structuring, page 157, is the structuring of the attuned intelligibility of being in the world. Its constituent factors are what discourse is about, what is discussed, what is said as such, communication, and making known. These are not properties which can be empirically snatched from language, but are existential characteristics rooted in the Constitution and the rooted in the Constitution. Where am I? Oh yeah, rooted in the Constitution, a being of design, which first makes something like language ontologically possible. Some of these factors can be lacking or remain unnoticed in the factual linguistic form of a particular discourse. The fact that they are often not verbally expressed is only an indication of a particular kind of discourse which, insofar as it is discourse, must always lie within the totality of these structures. Right? So, attempts to grasp the essence of language have always taken their orientation towards a single one of these factors and have understood language guided by the idea of expression and meaning, Husserl, symbolic forms, Cassirer, communication as statement, a whole group of linguists at that time, making known experiences, or the form of life. All of these are references, coded references to philosophical schools, right? Dilthey being the last one, the forms of life. But nothing would be gained for a completely sufficient definition of language if we were to put these different fragmentary definitions together in a syncretic way. What is decisive is to develop the ontological, existential totality of the structure of discourse beforehand on the basis of the analytic of design, the existential analytic. Okay, so he's going to go back to the existential analytic to go up with on discourse. Okay, so let me just move along a little bit so that we can get to care next time, and you can bring any questions you may have in this section because he goes through grammar and logos. On page 160, a lot of telegrammatology is coming out of this as well. Philosophical, one quote again that's important, in 160, philosophical research at the bottom of the page will have to give up philosophy of language if it is to ask about the things themselves, okay, Tom, and attain the status of a problematic that has been clarified conceptually. The foregoing interpretation of language has the sole function of pointing out the ontological place for this phenomena in the constitution of the being of design, and above all, preparing the way for the following analysis, in which, taking as our guideline a fundamental kind of being belonging to discourse in connection with other phenomena, we shall try to bring the everydayness of design into view in a way that is ontologically more primordial. So he's preparing us to bring the everydayness of design and of the there, right, in particular, more, clarifyingly into view, sharper and keener into view. And we're doing this through an analysis now of discourse, right, and the falling prey of design, right? So we want to make the disclosiveness. The falling prey of design is actually it being attracted to mob psychology or to the discussion of the dictatorship of the they self, right? Falling prey to the they, to the outside. You can see this in sociological literature, the outer directed person in David Reisman's The Lonely Cloud. The outer directed, the other directed, always need someone else. The unenlightened character in Kant that who cannot move without the guidance of another. In a way, this is an attack, and we can go back to this politically, an attack on the liberal state. Right? Many ways, right? Many ways. This little section here, in between. Okay. Idle talk, the next thing, is not to be used in a despairing sense, right? Is not to be used in a despairing, terminologically means a positive phenomena, which constitutes the mode of being of understanding and interpretation of every day. For the most part, discourse expresses itself and always already expressed itself. It is language. But then understanding and interpretation are not always already contained in what is expressed. As expression, language harbors in itself an interpretativeness of the understanding of Dasein. This interpretativeness is no more merely objective present than language is, but rather its being is in itself the character of Dasein. Dasein is initially, in certain limits, constantly entrusted to the interpretativeness that directs and apportions the possibilities of the average understanding and the attunement belonging to it. In the totality of its structured contents of signification, expression preserves an understanding of the disclosed world and thus equipped primordially an understanding of Dasein of others and of one's own being in. Okay, let me go down. Discourse expressing itself, next paragraph, is communication. Its tendency of being aims at bringing the hearer to participate in disclosed meaning toward what is being talked about in discourse. Okay. On page 163, the third paragraph, discourse, which belongs to the essential constitution of the being of design, also constitutes its disclosedness, has the possibility of becoming idle talk, and as such of not really keeping being in the world open to an articulated understanding, but of closing it off and covering over interworldly beings. To my mind, idle talk also means gossip and rumor, in some ways. So you can see that this has the possibility of foreclosure, always already in terms of a structure. By its very nature, idle talk, of the final sentence in that paragraph, is a closing off since it omits going back to the foundation of what is being talked about. Right? Groundlessly, he'll use all this thing about idle talk. I think this is an important topic here to get ready, is it? Not discourse, but idle talk. So we have a section, discourse proper, and then idle talk after discourse, right? Then he's going to go to curiosity, right? What is existential curiosity, right? And this, to me, is scopophilia, what Aristotle says, all men desire to know, all men desire to see. A kind of scopophilia, that's what he calls, right? This is the, if you will, the pornographic part of Heidegger, the curiosity, of section 36, right? Idle talk controls, page 166, the ways in which one may be curious. It says what one is to have read and seen. The being everywhere and nowhere of curiosity is entrusted to idle talk. These two everyday modes of being of discourse and sight are not objectively present side by side in their uprooting tendency, but their one way of being drags the other with it. Curiosity and idle talk. Interesting, huh? Okay. Curiosity for which nothing is closed off and idle talk for which there is nothing that is not understood provide themselves, that is the design existing in the way, with a guarantee of a supposedly, genuinely lively life. But with this supposition, a third phenomena shows itself as characterizing the disclosedness of everyday design. This is going to be ambiguity. So we go idle talk, right? Curiosity, and now ambiguity. These are the three modes, and you could say this is kind of inauthentic ways of being in the world with language, right? Even though we all do it, right? Okay? And then he goes on about ambiguity, and a great book on ambiguity is William Epson's The 7 Types of Ambiguity, a real classic in terms of you're interested in ambiguity, magnificent work on ambiguity. Okay. the crucial sentence, at least to me, paragraph 168, the ambiguity of the way things have been interpreted publicly passes off talking about things ahead of time and curious guessing as what is really happening, and it stamps carrying things out and taking action as something subsequent and of no importance. The understanding of design in the they thus constantly goes astray in its projects with regard to the genuine possibilities of being. So we're beginning to get the language of authenticity, the genuine, not only possibility, but now genuine possibility in Heidegger's language. He's starting to use these modifiers that begin to smack of the authenticity and authenticity. Right? All right? So, goes straight, is always ambiguously there, that is, in the public disclosure of being with one another, where the lightest outer talk and the most inventive curiosity keeps the business going. You can think about, what we're witnessing now, where everything happens in an everyday way and basically nothing happens at all. Kind of interesting how the machine works. Kierkegaard wrote a book called The Present Age. All the stuff's going on, but nothing really happens. The present age. Wrote that time at the same time as the Communist Manifesto. The conservative Dane wrote a book called The Present Age. The amazing thing about our age is so much is going on, but nothing actually happens. This is what he said. So Heidegger is kind of parodied, obviously he's read this, basically nothing happens at all. Ambiguity is always tossing to curiosity what it seeks, and it gives to idle talk the illusion of having everything decided in it. Interesting, right? The kind of being of the disclosure of being in the world, however, also dominates being with one another as such. The other is initially there in terms of what they have heard about him, what they say and know about him. Idle talk initially intrudes itself into the midst of primordial being with one another. Everyone keeps track of the other initially and first of all, watching how he will behave, what he will say to something. Being with one another in the they is not at all a self-contained, indifferent side-by-sideness, but a tense, ambiguous keeping track of each other, a secretive, reciprocal listening in. Here's your surveillance at work 27, right? Under the mask of the one for one another, the against one another is at play. This is going on in the structure of ambiguity. Here we must note ambiguity does not first originate out of explicit intention to dissimulate and distort, and that it is not called forth by the individual design. It is already implied with the being in one another, as thrown being with one another in a world. But publicly it is quite concealed, and they will always protest the possibility that the interpretation of this kind of being of interpreting the they could be correct. It would be a misunderstanding if the explication of these phenomena were to seek to be confirmed by the approval of the they. All right? The phenomena of idle talk, of curiosity and ambiguity were set forth in the last 10, 15 pages in such a way as to indicate they're already interconnected in their being. The kind of being of this connection must now be grasped existentially and ontologically. The basic kind of being of everydayness is to be understood in the horizon of the structures of the being of design hitherto obtained. And now we're going to go to falling prey, right? And this is the section on being entangled in the world and being tranquilized. And this is interesting here too. This is the, when we talked about the addictogenic society. This is a very good analysis, if you will, this falling prey and thrownness of our current situation in addictogenic philosophy, right? This is interesting. The falling prey, the third paragraph down, must not be interpreted as a fall from a pure and higher primordial condition, nor only do we not have any experience of this ontologically, but we also do not have the possibilities and guidelines for such an ontological interpretation. As a factical being in the world, Dasein falling prey is already falling away from itself. It is not falling prey to some being which it does or does not run into in the course of being, but falling prey to the world which itself belongs to its being. Right? To that a priori world. Falling prey is an existential determination of Dasein itself and says nothing about Dasein as something objectively present, or about present relations to beings from which it is derived, or to beings with which it has subsequently found itself in a commercium. The ontological, existential structure of falling prey would also be misunderstood if we wanted to attribute to it the meaning of a bad or deplorable ontic-quality would be removed in the advanced stages. We're not going to remove Trump's personality, right? In the advanced stages of human culture, right? All right, so let me go on to here. Bottom of the page 170, having already become a temptation for itself. In this way, being in the world is in itself tempting. The way in which things have been publicly interpreted holds fast to Dasein in its falling prey. Idle talk, ambiguity, having seen everything and having understood everything, develop the supposition that the disclosiveness of Dasein, thus available and prevalent, could guarantee to Dasein the certainty, genuineness, and fullness of all the possibilities of being. The self-certainty and decisiveness of the they increasingly propagate the sense there is no need of authentic and attuned understanding. Right? Going back to what I read from Marcuse at the beginning about this repressive tolerance, it's interesting here. The supposition of the they that one is leading and sustaining a full and genuine life brings a reassurance to Dasein, for which everything is in the best order and from whom all doors are open. Entangled being in the world, tempting itself is at the same time tranquilizing. Right? Yeah. You want to say something?
No, it's true. Kind of.
Yeah. This tranquilization in inauthentic being, however, does not seduce one into stagnation in activity, but what I put on the board earlier, but drives one to uninhibited busyness. And this is most of the people. Dylan's great line, you gargle in the rat race choir. You're not busy being born, you're busy dying, in a way. These are, very good phrases about this kind of tranquilization and uninhibited busyness. Right? So, very good, in a sense. So he uses the word alienation, first time we see this. Entangled being the world is not only tempting and tranquilizing, it is at the same time alienating. So Heidegger, unlike Marx, who talks about alienation from nature, alienation from spirit, alienation in work, right, and from each other, right, in these categories, Heidegger is going to use alienating in a sense after entangled being in the world, after the everydayness, right? It's alienation in everyday life, right? Entangled being in the world is not only tempting and tranquilizing, is at the same time alienating. However, this alienation cannot mean that Dasein is factically torn from itself. On the contrary, it drives Dasein into a kind of being intent upon the most exaggerated self-dissection, which tries out all kinds of possibilities of interpretation, with the result that the characterologies and typologies which it points out are themselves too numerous to grasp. Too many statistics. How do we explain this latest phenomenon? Always. Yet this alienation, which closes off to Dasein, it's authenticity. So you have this word, alienation and authenticity. To be authentic means to be unalienated, unalienated and interesting. And possibility, even if it's only of genuinely getting stranded, still does not surrender it to beings which it itself is not, but forces it into its inauthenticity. So alienation and inauthenticity are going together. This is crucial, right? Into a possible kind of being of itself. The tempting and tranquilizing alienation of falling prey has its own kind of movement, with the consequence that Dasein gets tangled up in itself. Okay? The phenomena pointed out of temptation, tranquilizing, alienation, and self-entanglement characterize the specific being of falling prey. So alienation for Heidegger, and probably for Stiegler as well, is part of the addictogenic society, right? Not so much just the factory work, right? in a way. Okay? So this is kind of an interesting way of looking at things. We call this kind of movement of Dasein in its own being the plunge. Good movie, huh? The plunge. The Absturz. Yeah, right. Dasein plunges out of itself, into the...
I'm sorry.
It's okay, it's okay. It's all right, Chris. It's everydayness. Falling prey to the object.
Musicality.
Yes, right. Dasein plunges out of itself, into the groundlessness, introversion, someone turning inward. You can read obviously between the lines in terms of, many of the symptoms of today's pathogenic, society, into the groundlessness and nothingness of inauthentic everydayness. But this plunge remains concealed from it by the way things have been publicly interpreted, so that it is interpreted as getting ahead and living concretely.
Yep.
Yuppies, millennials, all of these types are being described right here. Getting ahead, living concretely, right?
Yeah.
Falling prey,
Practical.
etc.
Yeah.
Uninhibited busyness, etc., right? All of these levels are really looked at in terms of the inauthenticity of that kind of life. Yeah. Even though they can afford the rent of the $6,000 a month for the 2-bedroom in Tribeca. What's up, you leaving?
Yeah, Stephen can't get in the gate, so he came here to meet me.
He can get in the gate. Here, I'll give you a card.
No,
You're not going to come to dinner?
No, we're going to a party,
Oh, you are?
and
You're going to fall prey to a party?
I'm falling prey, but it's only a revolving door,
Okay.
so he can't get
I mean, I can give you the card to get him through the revolving
no,
door.
that's okay.
I mean, here it is. You just swipe it.
Just gotta go.
Okay. I hope it's a good party.
It's a retirement party
Oh, that's always a good party. Yeah.
for the guy that teaches with him.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Sounds nice.
Sorry to disturb the class.
That's okay,
No,
Chris.
no,
No problem. We'll miss you tonight at dinner. We'll probably have a better time than the retirement party.
You probably will.
I'm just kidding. Yeah.
You probably will.
By the way, speaking of which, Saturday, 2 weeks, they're doing Night of Philosophy again. I have the
I saw.
schedule. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, 7 o'clock it begins. And our friend Jeremy Glick's going to talk on Hegel and Haiti. Hegel and the Kurdian.
Very good.
Yeah. So, Gayatri Spivak's going to talk about violence. Yeah, anyway, good luck. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So, this is interesting. This kind of a movement of plunging into and within the groundlessness of inauthentic being in the they constantly tears understanding away from projecting authentic possibilities, right? Okay? And drags it into the tranquilized supposition of possessing or attaining everything, right? Since the understanding is thus constantly torn away from authenticity and dragged into the they, although always with a sham of authenticity. I'm authentic, I'm the real deal. I'm a foodie. I know what kind of beer to drink, what kind of wine to drink. The movement of falling prey is characterized by turbulence. With what's really being experienced there. Yeah. Not only does falling prey determine being in the world existentially, but at the same time, turbulence reveals the character of throwing and the movement of thrownness, which can force itself upon Dasein in its attunement. Not only is thrownness not a finished fact, it is also not a self-contained fact. The facticity of Dasein is such that Dasein, as long as it is what it is, remains tossed about and sucked into the turbulence of the they's inauthenticity. You can see Heidegger writing this, just looking around,
Really.
Thrownness, in which facticity can be seen only phenomenally, belongs to Dasein, which is concerned in its being about that being. Dasein exists factually. But now that falling prey has been exhibited, have we not set forth a phenomena which directly speaks against the definition in which the formal idea of existence was indicated? Can Dasein be conceived as a being whose being is concerned with potentiality for being, if this being has lost itself precisely in its everydayness and lives away from itself in falling prey. Falling prey to the world is, however, phenomenal evidence against the existentiality of Dasein, only if Dasein is posited as an isolated I subject, as a self point from which it moves away. Then the world is an object. Falling prey to the world is then reinterpreted ontologically as objective presence in the matter of interworldly beings. However, if we hold on, this is important, to the being of Dasein in the Constitution indicated a being in the world, it becomes evident that falling prey as the kind of being of this being in represents the most elemental proof for the existentiality of Dasein. In falling prey, nothing other than our potentiality for being in the world is the issue, even if in the mode of inauthenticity. Dasein can fall prey only because it is concerned with understanding, attuned being in the world. On the other hand, authentic existence is nothing which hovers over entangled everydayness, but is existentially only a modified grasp of everydayness. So we begin to see the beginning of the dichotomy, of inauthentic and authentic here, that he's going to work with later on in sections, 40, later in the 40s, and certainly in the sections on death, being towards death and possibility. Okay, the phenomena of falling prey does not give something like a night view of Dasein, a properly occurring ontically which might serve to round out the harmless aspect of this being. Falling prey reveals an essential and also an ontological structure of Dasein itself. Far from determining its nocturnal side, it constitutes all of its days in its everydayness. Our existential ontological interpretation thus does not make any ontic statement about the corruption of human nature. This is not language for Heidegger. Not because the necessary evidence is lacking, because it's problematic as prior to any statement about corruption or incorruption. Falling prey is an ontological concept of motion. Ontically, we have not decided whether human being is drowned in sin, in the corrupted status, or whether it walks in the integrated status or finds itself in an interim stage, the status of grace. But faith and worldview, when they state such and such a thing, and when they speak about Dasein as being in the world, must come back to the existential structure set forth, provided their statements at the same time seem to be conceptually comprehensible. The leading question pursued in this chapter pursued the being of the there, right? The being of the there. Its theme was the ontological constitution of the disclosedness essentially belonging to Dasein. The being of disclosedness is constituted in attunement, in an understanding, and discourse. Its everyday mode of being is characterized by we gossip, we rumor, idle talk, curiosity, our scopophilia, etc., and then our ambiguity vis-a-vis the they-self. These show the kind of movement of falling prey with the essential characteristics of temptation, tranquilization, alienation, and entanglement. With analysis, however, the totality of the existential constitution of Dasein has been laid bare in its major features, and the phenomenal basis has been attained for a comprehensive interpretation of the being of Dasein as care. So we've gotten the symptomatic, right, in the first 36 sections, right, or 39, I think 39, right, 38 sections, right, here with, laying of the problematic, and then going through everything from, our earlier parts on understanding, but before that, the ready to hand, the things present to hand, the difference between fundamental and foundational ontology. He set all this up. Now he's shown all the symptoms, right? How crucial understanding, interpretation, and discourse are as a new kind of triad, to work with. And this forehaving, this forestructure, this forecircumspection, all of these things are very, very important for our having beenness as we go forward. And now we're going to go into the essential fable, if you will, like the allegory of the cave is to the Republic. The fable of Cura is to being in time. He's going to use the story of care. And I'll read that. Maybe we can close there if that's okay.
Yeah.
Is that all right? It's 5:45.
You can see how this guy ended up in the Black Forest, you know?
It comes from.
I don't think he ever left the Black
Yeah.
It was there. It was there. Right?
Yeah.
So let's turn. Just read the section, and then maybe we can begin with care next time, and then go on to the temporality part as well. So the fable itself, and he'll continue, with the primordial structural whole. Again, he's still discovering. And then anxiety, attunement of anxiety, is section 40. But if we get to the question of care, page 190 is the actual discourse. He reproduces the Latin, and this is from a book on Faust and care, a reading of Goethe's Faust, right, by a man named Burdak, and it's reproduced here. Back top of page 191. Once when care was crossing a river, cura in the Latin, she saw some clay. She thoughtfully took a piece and began to shape it. When she was thinking about what she had made, Jupiter came by. Care asked him to give it spirit, and this he gladly granted. But when she wanted her name to be bestowed upon it, Jupiter forbade this and demanded to be given his name instead. While Care and Jupiter were arguing, Earth, Tellus, arose and desired that her name be conferred upon the creature, since she had offered it part of her body. They asked Saturn to be the judge, and Saturn gave them the following decision, which seemed to be just. Since you, Jupiter, have given it spirit, you shall receive that spirit in death. And since you, Earth, have given it body, you shall receive its body. But since Care first shaped this creature, she shall possess it as long as it lives. And because there is a dispute among you to its name, let it be called Homo, for it is made out of humus, earth. It's a nice fable, huh? Beautiful, huh?
That's very nice.
The spirit goes to the heaven, right, to Zeus, right?
Everyone's happy.
Yeah, everyone gets happy, right? You can have it while it's here. The lady can shape it and mold it. And, again, this whole thing about, the feminine world, right, in the German, this is Cura, who will possess, the everydayness and the shaping, and will belong to Care. So Care becomes the fundamental structure. So this is the fable on which the book itself, like the allegory of the cave in Plato, this is the fable on which being and time hinges, right? Care as significant, right? So he'll go through the whole. He'll do an explication here of Care, Cura, and others. And I thought what we should read too. I know I didn't assign it. Is 43 because that brings back this whole question of objectivity, and the question of realism and idealism. So if you can look at that section as well, right? And I would skip the section on truth and all that. We can go and then go on to, like I said, section 75, right, at the end on time. You're going to see 78, the incompleteness of the foregoing temporal analysis of time. I think that's where I want to begin. Yeah, I don't want to do. Yeah, because we'll go back to chapter 5. Let's begin with chapter 6, because we're going to go back to history last, because I'm thinking of historical time in the Althusserian Marxist sense, and then Heidegger's notion of historicality and historicity too. So let's begin 385 as much as you can. I mean, it's dense. It's only 15 and about 27, 28 pages, but it's dense, and again, focused somewhat, as if you can, on the footnote on page 410.
Okay.
Right? And we'll begin to see the difference between Bergson, Aristotle, Hegel, and Heidegger in terms of notions of time. Right? Okay? And then we'll go backwards we'll go back and read about authenticity and inauthenticity. I think it makes sense because we've been, putting off the temporal horizon for a while, and instead of to read it, I want to read it somewhat retrospectively as well. So you'll have that dimension because the interpretation and understanding and interpretation and discourse are all taking place in the horizon of time. So we have to, think about this and, ask that question. All right? Okay, we're good for today, or? Yeah, you sure? Okay, all right. Okay. Good. Just wanted to mention, he mentions Parmenides on 165, this return to Parmenides, being and thinking of the same. And then, of course, care cannot be split up. It's whole. Okay, cannot be divided, right? Right? And it has care is not about drives, so he's against Freudian drive theory and psychological drive theory. Willing and wishing are not part of this in terms of care, or urge, predilection, right? Are not there either, right? In the notion of care. Okay, and then the fundamental structures of care will be anxiety, carefulness, and dedication.